The city breathes at night in ways the daylight never reveals. Its lungs expand with shadows and whispered warnings, its heartbeat a distant percussion of car horns and rolling wheels. And in this living darkness, among the brick and asphalt that never quite grows warm, a small creature has learned to exist in the margins. There is no birth certificate for this cat, no carefully recorded pedigree. There are only the facts of survival written into bone and sinew. A body conditioned by hunger, sharpened by threat, made resilient by the relentless machinery of staying alive. The kitten that would one day find home first had to learn what home could never be. The streets became its tutor in cruelty and cunning both. The earliest memories are not memories at all, but rather a series of sensations so primal they bypass language entirely. Hunger, raw, gnawing, all-consuming hunger that teaches a creature that the world is not made for comfort. Cold that seeps through fur and skin into the very marrow of bones, teaching that warmth is a privilege, not a right. Fear, acute, crystalline, ever-present fear that transforms every shadow into a possible threat, every human into an unknown variable that could extend cruelty or, more rarely, a fragment of kindness. This kitten was born to a mother who had herself survived the streets through a combination of instinct and desperation. The mother's body was thin, her eyes holding the particular wariness of animals who have learned that survival is never guaranteed. She had found shelter beneath an abandoned warehouse, that transitional space where the city's forgotten things accumulate. Broken furniture, discarded dreams, and the detritus of human carelessness. It was there, in that concrete cavity that held neither warmth nor safety, that she gave birth to 4 kittens. 3 of them did not survive the first weeks. 1 died of infection. 1 simply failed to thrive, as though the world's indifference was too heavy a burden for such a small body to bear. 1 vanished one night, snatched by the larger predators that prowl the urban wilderness, or perhaps taken by a human who might have offered rescue or harm. The mother would never know. But this 4th kitten, this one inherited something from its mother, an almost stubborn will to persist, a refusal to accept the role of victim without a fight. The mother taught the kitten what she knew. She showed it which restaurants put out their garbage at particular hours, which alleys offered shelter from the rain, which humans were likely to chase, and which might toss food instead of stones. She taught it through example, through the particular language of feline communication, the low growl that said, "Danger approaches," the deliberate slow blink that said, "You are safe with me, be still." She taught survival through every interaction, every meal found and defended, every escape executed with split-second precision. But teaching and learning are not the same as understanding. The kitten did not comprehend why the world was arranged this way, why some humans emerged from metal boxes with full bellies, while it fought with rats for scraps, why some places offered shelter while others held only exposure and threat, why its mother sometimes seemed gentle and nurturing, and at other times distant and frightened, as though she had suddenly remembered something terrible and needed to withdraw from love itself. The city itself became the kitten's true teacher. Every corner of the urban landscape held lessons. The streets were highways of danger, metal boxes hurtling past at speeds that could obliterate a small body in an instant. The kitten learned to read the rhythms of traffic, to judge the trajectory of spinning wheels, to slip between vehicles with the precision of a creature that understood instinctively that a single mistake meant death. It learned that the daylight hours were often safer, that humans were more unpredictable when night fell and their vision grew poor. The alleyways offered better lessons. Here, among the narrow passages where buildings leaned toward each other like gossiping old women, there was less traffic, more opportunity. The kitten learned which dumpsters and trash bins held the best food, the restaurants that tossed out meat scraps, the bakeries that threw away stale bread. It learned the hierarchy of scavenging, understood that larger rats and possums had first claim, that only when they had fed could smaller creatures approach. Other cats were both allies and enemies. The kitten's mother maintained an uneasy truce with several other felines who inhabited the same territory. They shared information through marking and scent, warnings about a particularly aggressive territorial male, information about areas where humans had laid out food in conscious attempts to help the cats survive. But there was also competition, sometimes violence. The kitten learned to fight when necessary, learned that teeth and claws could be both tools and weapons, learned that sometimes the only way to survive was to hurt something else first. Humans remained the great unknown variable. The kitten had learned to associate them with both food and danger. Some humans threw things, some called animal control, some drove the kitten away with broom handles and harsh voices. But others left food deliberately, set out small dishes of water, spoke in soft voices, and sometimes, if the kitten was brave enough to approach, extended their hands for the kitten to sniff and rub against. These moments, rare as they were, created a problem in the kitten's developing brain. They suggested that kindness existed, that the world contained possibilities beyond mere survival. They planted seeds of longing that made life on the streets harder, not easier. The seasons turned, and the kitten grew, its body becoming stronger, its mind sharper, its understanding of the street's ruthless logic more complete. Spring brought abundance, birds nesting in high places, insects proliferating, humans more likely to linger outside and perhaps share food. The kitten's body filled out, its coat became glossier. For a few weeks, survival seemed less precarious. But summer brought different challenges. The heat was oppressive, driving many humans indoors where air conditioning hummed behind sealed windows. Restaurants became more aggressive about protecting their garbage. The insects the kitten relied on for supplementary protein became concentrated in fewer locations, meaning more competition from other cats and creatures. The kitten learned to find ways to cool down, to seek out damp areas, to time its hunting for early morning and dusk when the temperature dropped slightly. It learned to ration its energy, to spend long hours lying still in shadowed corners, to move only when necessity demanded. The kitten's mother was growing older, thinner. The kitten could sense the change, could smell the difference in her body odor, could read the subtle shifts in her behavior. She had become more withdrawn, more likely to snap at the kitten if it approached too closely. This was natural. The mother was preparing to let go, was instinctively beginning the process of separation that would allow the kitten to establish its own territory, its own survival strategy. What the kitten did not understand was that its mother was dying, that her body was failing under the accumulated stress of years spent fighting for mere existence. The kitten found a territory of its own, an area encompassing several blocks, a mixture of commercial buildings, small houses, and a city park where pigeons gathered in the morning. It was here that the kitten established its daily patterns, its familiar routes, its knowledge of every potentially useful location. There was the corner store whose owner sometimes left food scraps out for the cat. There was the small Italian restaurant whose dumpster regularly contained bones and vegetable matter suitable for a cat's needs. There was the park with its pigeons and squirrels, though hunting them was more aspiration than accomplishment. The kitten's body reached full size, while its mind remained shaped by the street's harsh logic. It was a beautiful creature, if one could see past the scars and the wary expression that never fully left its face. Its eyes held an intelligence born of constant vigilance. Its body, lean and muscular, bore the marks of fights survived and dangers navigated. Its coat, which might have been a striking gray if properly groomed, was instead matted and dirty, offering better camouflage among the city's drab tones. Hunger was the baseline of existence. The kitten never felt truly full. It learned to eat whenever food appeared, never knowing when the next meal would come. It learned to defend its meals from other animals, to eat quickly without true enjoyment, to consume things that might, in different circumstances, have been considered inedible: stale food, spoiled meat, anything with caloric value. The hunger never disappeared. It simply became part of the landscape of consciousness, like the background noise of traffic or the smell of exhaust. But hunger was only the most obvious challenge. Disease was ever present. The kitten had already survived several parasitic infections, its young body fighting off the invasions instinctively. There had been a respiratory illness that lasted weeks, during which the kitten coughed and struggled to breathe, losing weight precipitously. It had survived through luck and the accidents of immunity, through stumbling upon humans who saw its distress and left extra food, through the accident of harboring a body stubborn enough to fight off infection. The kitten's relationship with danger had become almost casual through repetition. It had been chased by larger animals, stray dogs and feral cats who saw it as either threat or prey. It had narrowly escaped from cars, learning to judge distance and speed with mathematical precision. It had encountered humans with cruel intentions and had learned to read their body language, to flee before violence could be enacted. It had also encountered humans with gentle intentions and had learned to read that too, though gentleness was rare enough to remain almost surprising each time it occurred. By late autumn of its first year, the kitten had become a young cat, hardened by experience, wise in the ways of the street, yet still carrying within itself a capacity for curiosity, and even for something that might be called hope. It did not understand its own existence in any philosophical sense. It did not ask why it had been born into such circumstances, or whether life could be different. But it moved through the city with a particular grace, and in its eyes there remained something that had not been entirely killed by hardship. A spark that suggested that somewhere, somehow, life might offer more than mere survival. As autumn progressed toward winter, the cat sensed the changing seasons through every cell of its body. The days grew shorter, the temperatures dropped. The heating pipes in the buildings it hid near began their loud clanking, warmth bleeding out into the streets in small patches. The cat knew, through instinct inherited from ancestors and sharpened by personal experience, that winter was coming, a time when survival became exponentially more difficult, when cold claimed the weak, when food became scarcer. The cat began the unconscious work of preparing, eating more, building fat reserves, searching for better shelter. In these preparations lay the tragedy of the stray cat's existence. The kitten had done nothing to deserve the circumstances of its birth. It had committed no crime that warranted this punishment. Yet here it was, at the turning of seasons, facing another winter on the streets with nothing but its instincts and its will to survive. Its mother, wherever she had gone, was likely suffering the same fate. The other cats of its kind, scattered through the city, faced the same challenges. And above it all, in the warm buildings where humans had arranged their lives, there existed comfort and safety that the cat could sense but not access. The city at night had always seemed like a separate dimension, the traffic thinning, the humans disappearing into their boxes of light and warmth, the darkness expanding. But as the days shortened, the nights seemed to grow deeper, colder, more hostile. The cat found itself spending more time searching for shelter, less time hunting, because the hunting had become less productive. Its body, which had filled out during summer, began to show the outlines of its ribs again. And in that cold and that hunger, in that searching and that fighting, in that small body containing an enormous will to survive, in all of that, the cat waited. It did not know it was waiting. It did not understand that somewhere in the city, on a cold evening that was not yet quite winter, someone would look out a window and notice something small and frightened huddled in the rain. Someone would make a choice. Someone would see not an animal to be ignored, but a life worth saving. But that moment was still ahead. For now there was only the city, only the streets, only the grinding reality of another day survived, another night endured, another meal found in the debris of human abundance. The cat's story had not yet become a story at all. It was still merely the raw material of existence, a small creature, persisting against the odds, waiting unknowingly for the moment when the narrative of survival would transform into something else entirely. Winter was coming. The cat could feel it. And somewhere inside that small, fierce body, beneath the scars and the wariness, there existed a capacity for transformation, a potential that had never yet been awakened. That potential, dormant as it was, would soon meet the circumstances required to bring it into being. The rain came early that November, not with the gentle arrival of autumn precipitation, but with the sudden, almost hostile descent. The rain came early that November, not with the gentle arrival of autumn precipitation, but with the sudden, almost hostile descent of weather that seemed to carry winter's cruelty in its drops. The clouds had gathered throughout the day, dark and swollen, and by late afternoon the city had taken on the bruised appearance of something wounded. The streets, wet and gleaming under the occasional streetlight, became rivers of reflection. The city doubled in the water, fragmented and distorted. The cat had spent the morning hunting unsuccessfully in the park. The pigeons, seeming to sense the coming storm, had vanished into whatever shelters they maintained. The squirrels had retreated to their nests. Even the rats, usually bold enough to venture out at any hour, seemed to have disappeared. The cat had found a stale piece of bread near the Italian restaurant and consumed it without enjoyment, knowing that bread provided almost no nutrition, but hoping that the act of eating might ease the constant background ache of hunger. As the afternoon progressed, the cat's instincts screamed warnings about the coming weather. The barometric pressure dropping, the changed smell in the air, the particular quality of light filtering through the clouds, all of this created an urgency that the cat understood without words. Shelter. The cat needed shelter. It couldn't spend the night exposed to this particular storm. The coat that had been its only protection against the elements would be useless against wind-driven rain. The cold would follow the moisture, and a wet coat in cold temperatures meant a loss of body heat so rapid that hypothermia could occur. The cat knew several shelter locations. There was the warehouse where it had been born. The cat knew several shelter locations. There was the warehouse where it had been born, its mother long since moved on or dead. The cat had not returned there in months, sensed somehow that territory as belonging to the past. There was a discarded industrial cooler behind the Korean grocery store, large enough for the cat to curl into, insulated in a way that retained warmth. There was the alcove beneath the veterinary clinic's loading dock, a small space that had never been utilized for its intended purpose and offered reasonable protection from wind and direct rain. The cat was moving toward the veterinary clinic when it heard the voice. The voice was human. The voice was human, of course. The cat had heard thousands of human voices by this point in its life, harsh and helpful, angry and gentle, indifferent and engaged. But this voice held a particular quality that made the cat pause. It was calling in that insistent way humans sometimes did, and the cat recognized that the call might be directed at it. This was unusual. Most humans either ignored cats entirely or actively drove them away. The calls directed at cats typically came from children, and the cat had learned that children could be unpredictable, sometimes offering food, sometimes throwing things, sometimes grabbing and squeezing too hard. But something about this voice seemed different. It carried a tone of concern rather than anger. It was calling something, "Here, here, come here," with a gentleness that made the primitive part of the cat's brain register the possibility of safety. The cat turned to look. A human stood on a residential porch about half a block away. The human was female, the cat would later realize, though at that moment the cat only registered the basic facts. Two-legged creature, upright posture, wearing a jacket because of the weather, making calling sounds directed at the cat. The human stood in the porch light, which meant the cat could see her clearly, but she would have difficulty seeing the cat, backlit against the darker street. This was an advantage the cat understood instinctively. The human couldn't grab what she couldn't see with precision. The woman, her name was Elena, though the cat would not learn this for some time, had noticed the cat 3 days earlier, during the last clear afternoon before the storm system moved in. Elena had been sitting on her porch reading when a movement caught her eye. A small cat, thin and wary, had approached the neglected flower garden at the front of her property, investigating for insects or mice. Elena, who had grown up with pets but had allowed the habit to lapse as an adult, found herself unexpectedly moved by the sight of this small creature, moving through the world with such obvious wariness. She had gone inside and found some tuna in her pantry, a can she had been keeping for emergency snacking. She opened it, placed some pieces on the porch railing, and waited. The cat, smelling the food, had approached with exaggerated caution, checked the tuna multiple times, and finally began eating while Elena watched from a distance. The interaction had lasted perhaps 10 minutes total, after which the cat had disappeared back into the neighborhood. But the encounter had planted something in Elena's consciousness, a small seed of connection, a sense that here was a life struggling, and perhaps something could be done about it. For 3 days, Elena had watched for the cat. She had put out food each afternoon, tuna sometimes small pieces of cooked chicken she had prepared. Sometimes the cat came, sometimes it didn't. Elena had found herself spending portions of her day thinking about this cat, wondering where it went at night, whether it found enough food, how it had come to be living on the streets. Elena worked as a social worker, helping people navigate the welfare system and access support services. Her job had taught her that need was widespread and most suffering was invisible. But the cat's need was visible, was right here on her property, was something she could potentially address. When the rain began that afternoon, Elena found herself worrying about the cat. She looked out windows at intervals, checking the storm's progress. She thought about putting food out, but realized that any food she left would be washed away by the rain. She thought about the cat's small body, likely already lean, likely suffering from parasites and illness. She thought about how quickly a small animal could die in harsh conditions. These thoughts led to other thoughts, about rescue shelters, about whether a stray cat could be caught and brought to safety, about the complex logistics of animal rescue. By late afternoon, with the rain now coming down in earnest, Elena had made a decision. She didn't have a clear plan, but she had a definite intention. She would try to help this cat if she could find it. She put on a rain jacket, grabbed a small container of tuna and a flashlight, and went out into the wet evening. The rain had driven most humans and animals indoors. The streets, normally active even in late afternoon, had taken on the lonely quality of a stage after the audience had departed. Elena walked slowly, calling occasionally, shining her flashlight into shadows and under bushes where a small cat might shelter. She knew she was being inefficient. She knew that the cat might have already found shelter and likely would not approach a human anyway. But the alternative was to stay inside, warm and dry, while an animal she had connected with suffered. Elena found this impossible. In her work, she had learned that compassion was an action verb. Caring meant doing something, even if what you could do was small and uncertain. The cat, for its part, had heard the calling from several blocks away and had recognized it as coming from the human with the food. The cat was wet now, having been caught outside when the rain intensified. Its fur was plastered against its body, which made it appear even smaller and thinner than usual. The cold was becoming significant. The cat's body temperature was already beginning to drop, a process that would accelerate if shelter wasn't found soon. The cat knew Elena through the tuna. The cat had learned the pattern of Elena's presence. The cat understood, at whatever cognitive level cats understand such things, that this human had shown kindness, had offered food, had not chased or threatened. This knowledge warred with the cat's instinctive wariness of humans. The cat had been struck by humans. The cat had been chased. The cat had learned that humans could be unpredictable and dangerous. But the rain was terrible. The cold was penetrating. The cat's options were limited. When Elena appeared at the corner, shining her flashlight, the cat was crouched under a low bush, trying unsuccessfully to keep itself dry. The light found the cat, illuminating the small figure, the eyes reflecting the flashlight beam in that particular way that made cats visible in the darkness. Elena stopped moving. She understood that sudden movements would spook the cat. She sat down on the wet sidewalk, not closing the distance between them, but making herself less threatening through the simple act of becoming smaller, lower, less of a looming presence. "Hello," Elena said quietly. "I'm not going to hurt you. I have food." The cat stared at the human. The rain drummed down around them both. The city, in the dark and the wet, seemed to have contracted to just this moment, this human, this cat, this moment of potential connection. Elena opened the container of tuna. The smell, even through the rain, traveled to the cat's nostrils. The cat's hunger responded to that smell with an immediacy that bypassed thought. The cat had learned to associate the smell of tuna with this human and with sustenance. The cat was cold, was wet, was suffering. The certainty of the human as immediate threat had to be weighed against the possibility of food, of shelter, of something that the street had not provided. The cat stood up, shook water from its fur, a useless gesture, but cats performed their grooming rituals even in crisis, and took a tentative step toward Elena. Elena remained still, making herself into a patient shape, a figure of stability in the chaos of weather. She didn't try to touch the cat. She didn't make sudden movements. She simply existed as the source of the tuna smell, as a shelter from the storm, as a possibility of something better than this moment. The cat moved closer. One step, then another. The fear was still there, the wariness still active. But hunger and cold were more present, more immediate. The cat reached the container of tuna and began to eat, its small body shaking from cold, its eyes occasionally flicking up to check the human's movements. Elena watched the cat eat and felt something shift inside her, a commitment forming, a sense that this small moment of connection had to mean something. She couldn't let this cat return to the streets. She couldn't pretend she hadn't seen its suffering. The rain intensified. Thunder rolled somewhere in the distance. The cat continued eating, its desperation overcoming its wariness. Elena slowly reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small blanket. A child's blanket that she had grabbed from her car before leaving the house, without quite knowing why she had grabbed it, simply following an instinct that she might need it. Very slowly, Elena moved the blanket toward the cat. "It's okay," she said. "I'm not going to hurt you. I want to help you." The cat's instincts screamed warnings. The blanket was movement. Movement meant danger. The cat took a step back, ready to flee. But the rain came down harder, and Elena didn't follow. She simply held the blanket open, a gesture of offering rather than threat. The cat was caught in a moment of profound decision. Every instinct born of months on the streets told it to run. The world was dangerous. Humans were unpredictable. Accepting help from someone might lead to capture, to pain, to something worse than the cold. But another instinct, more ancient perhaps, buried deep in the cat's genetic memory, recognized the blanket as shelter, Elena as a potential source of safety, this moment as a possible threshold between two different kinds of life. The cat moved toward the blanket. Elena held herself perfectly still as the cat approached and stepped into the fabric. She pulled the blanket around the small shaking body, creating a pouch of relative warmth and dryness. The cat, encased in the blanket, continued to eat from the container that Elena held inside the fabric with it. "I'm going to take you inside," Elena said. "I'm going to keep you warm, and I'm going to help you. I promise." The cat couldn't understand the words, but something in Elena's voice, a certainty, a gentleness, seemed to communicate something to the frightened animal. The cat was being held now, was being carried, was moving away from the street through the rain toward a brightly lit building. This was everything a street cat had been trained to fear: capture, containment, loss of agency. But it was also warmth. It was also shelter. It was also the possibility that something other than hunger and fear might exist. Elena moved carefully through the rain, back toward her house, holding the blanket-wrapped cat close to her body, trying to share her warmth with the shivering animal. She spoke softly the whole way, reassurances and promises and gentle sounds, even though she had no way of knowing if the cat understood any of it. Perhaps what mattered was not understanding, but the simple fact of comfort being offered, of someone choosing to help rather than look away. When Elena reached her house, she carried the cat inside and kicked the door closed against the rain and wind. The shelter was immediate and complete. Warm air, bright light, the absence of wind and rain. The cat experienced these things as a sudden and almost shocking departure from everything it had known. Elena set the blanket-wrapped cat down on her kitchen floor and turned up the heat, then gathered towels and laid out a space in a quiet corner where the cat might feel secure. The cat, still wrapped in the blanket, began to assess this new territory. Its eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and wonder, took in the details: the human moving about, the strange smells of a human dwelling, the absence of threat. The cat trembled, whether from cold or fear or the sheer strangeness of the situation was unclear. Elena fetched a can of food, something more substantial than tuna, and placed it in the corner near where the cat was sitting. She set water in a bowl nearby. She turned down the lights to something less harsh, giving the cat time and space to acclimate. And then she did something important. She sat down on the floor, several feet away from the cat, and simply waited. The waiting was how trust would begin. Not through forcing contact, not through trying to convince the cat that it was safe through words or gestures, but through the simple demonstration of patience, presence, and non-threat. The cat, frightened and uncertain as it was, would need time to understand that this place operated according to different rules than the street. Outside, the rain continued to fall. The storm raged through the night. But inside Elena's house, in the warmth and light, something had shifted in the universe. A lost creature had been found. A story that had been only about survival was about to become something more. A story about rescue, about transformation, about the possibility that when a life is seen, truly seen by another consciousness, that seeing itself becomes a kind of salvation. The cat huddled in its blanket, afraid still, but no longer alone in the darkness. The first night was a catalogue of fear and small mercies. The cat, having finally consumed the food Elena left and drunk water until its belly felt dangerously full, eventually exhausted itself and fell into an uneasy sleep in the corner of the kitchen. It slept in bursts, never fully relaxing into unconsciousness, jerking awake every few minutes to assess the environment, to ensure that the human had not moved closer, that escape routes remained available. Elena, watching from the living room where she sat in a chair with a book she was not reading, understood that this was normal. The cat's nervous system had been rewired by months on the streets. Trust would not come easily or quickly. Morning brought a crisis. The cat, which had not used a litter box in months, indeed had likely never used one, was compelled by its biology to eliminate waste. It did this on Elena's kitchen tile, distressed by the indoor environment, unable to understand that relief could be found in a designated box. Elena, cleaning up the accident with patience rather than frustration, felt the weight of the responsibility she had taken on. This cat needed more than food and shelter. It needed guidance, education, veterinary care. It needed someone to be willing to translate between the world it had known and the world she was introducing it to. The first morning also brought the revelation of the cat's physical condition. In the light of day, without the camouflage of darkness and wet fur, the cat was a study in hardship. Its bones were prominent, visible beneath its matted coat. Its fur, when examined closely, revealed mats so extensive they would require professional grooming to address. One ear showed signs of infection. The cat's eyes, while alert and intelligent, were underlined with what might be called worry or trauma, a particular configuration of muscles that spoke to chronic stress. Elena made a decision that morning. She called her veterinarian and explained the situation, that she had rescued a stray cat that appeared to be in poor health and needed immediate assessment. The receptionist, registering the note of urgency in Elena's voice, fit her in for an afternoon appointment. Elena then faced the challenge of transporting the cat to the clinic. She had no carrier, so she lined a plastic storage bin with towels and placed the cat inside. The cat, sensing that something significant was happening, became almost cooperative, as though on some level it understood that it needed help and that Elena was the conduit through which that help would arrive. The veterinary clinic was a revelation of order and purpose. The walls held posters about vaccination schedules, spaying and neutering, dental care. The waiting room smelled of disinfectant and the particular odor of animal medicine, a mixture of medications and the biological reality of creatures in distress. When the veterinarian, Dr. Sarah Chen, examined the cat, her face moved through a series of expressions. First, clinical assessment, then concern, then something that might have been anger at the suffering visible on the animal. "This cat is in rough shape," Dr. Chen said, her hands moving over the cat's body, checking lymph nodes, listening to the heart and lungs with a stethoscope, looking into the ears and eyes and mouth. "How long has it been on the street?" "I'm not sure," Elena admitted. "I only just brought it in from the rain. It could have been out there for months, maybe years." Dr. Chen nodded, continuing her examination. "We'll need to do blood work to check for feline leukemia and immunodeficiency virus. We'll need to do a fecal exam to check for parasites. We'll need to address the ear infection. The teeth are in terrible shape. There's tartar buildup, and I can see what looks like early decay. This cat is going to need dental work, likely extractions." Elena listened to the catalog of problems and felt the weight of responsibility crystallize into something more concrete. She was committed now. Whatever this would cost, whatever this would require, she would see it through. The blood work came back 2 days later. The cat tested negative for leukemia and feline immunodeficiency virus, which Dr. Chen called good news, and Elena understood to mean this cat's physical foundation is intact enough that it can recover. The fecal exam revealed 2 types of parasites. The ear infection was confirmed as a simple bacterial infection, treatable with drops. The teeth, as Dr. Chen had suspected, were in such poor condition that extraction would be necessary. Under anesthesia, they would remove the most damaged ones and do what they could with the rest. The dental surgery was scheduled for the following week. In the interim, Elena began the gradual work of helping the cat transition to indoor life. She established a routine. feeding at specific times, a clean litter box, quiet spaces for rest, gentle human contact when the cat seemed receptive. The cat, processing these changes with the intensity of a creature whose entire world had shifted, began to develop what might be called a schedule. It ate at predictable hours. It used the litter box consistently after the first few days, as though some latent memory of how these boxes functioned had awakened. It began to spend more time in the open, rather than hiding in corners, though it still withdrew to the safety of Elena's bedroom closet when overwhelmed. There was a moment, about 4 days after arrival, when the cat's fear shifted slightly. Elena was sitting on the couch reading when the cat approached, walked directly across her lap, and settled into a ball on her leg. The cat didn't purr. Its muscles remained somewhat tense. But it sat there, on Elena, the simple fact of its presence a kind of communication. Elena barely breathed, afraid that any movement might break the spell. She remained motionless for nearly an hour while the cat slept on her lap, and in that hour felt something shift inside herself as well. The understanding that she was not just housing this cat, but becoming woven into its narrative, just as it was becoming woven into hers. The dental surgery came and went. The cat was anesthetized, and Dr. Chen extracted 4 teeth, cleaned the remaining ones, and treated the infection. The cat woke groggy and sore, but the procedure had been necessary. Elena spent the evening after surgery sitting beside the cat, making sure it was comfortable, monitoring its recovery. The cat, even in its medicated state, seemed relieved. The source of discomfort in its mouth addressed, the infection beginning to clear. Meanwhile, Elena had been researching. She had called several cat rescue organizations to understand the full context of what she was undertaking. She learned that the work she was doing, taking in a stray cat, providing veterinary care, preparing it for adoption, was exactly what rescue organizations did. She learned that she was, in effect, a foster home, though she hadn't thought of it in those terms. She learned about the thousands of cats that entered shelters every year, many of them stray or abandoned. She learned about the resources available to help them, about the network of volunteers and rescuers working to change the fate of cats like this one. She also learned something that deepened her understanding of the cat's behavior. The woman at one rescue organization explained the concept of socialization windows, the critical periods in a cat's early life when exposure to humans and environmental stimuli created lasting impacts on the cat's ability to adapt. This cat, having missed most of that socialization window, would carry some of its street wariness permanently. It would never be a cat that trusted everyone. But with time, patience, and consistent kindness, it could learn to trust one person, or a small group of people. It could learn that home was safe. It could learn that humans could mean comfort rather than threat. This understanding transformed Elena's approach. She stopped trying to push the cat toward affection. Instead, she simply made herself available, a consistent, kind, predictable presence. She sat in rooms where the cat was. She spoke in calm, low tones. She allowed the cat to approach her when it chose to, rather than reaching for it when it was neutral or withdrawn. She began to understand that rescue was not about forcing transformation, but about creating conditions in which transformation could occur. 3 weeks into the cat's stay, Elena noticed something remarkable. The cat's body was changing. The ribs were less prominent. The coat, while still not luxurious, was beginning to regain luster. The cat was gaining weight at a healthy pace, consuming food with what seemed like genuine enjoyment rather than desperate urgency. The eye infection had cleared. The ear was healing. The cat was beginning to look like an actual cat rather than a creature in crisis. More significantly, the cat's behavior was changing. It began to initiate contact with Elena more frequently. It would jump onto the couch where Elena sat and curl up next to her. It began to purr, at first rarely, then more frequently, then seemingly on demand whenever Elena petted it. It began to play with toys, batting at a feather on a string with movements that combined hunting instinct with something that looked remarkably like joy. One evening, About a month after arriving at Elena's house, the cat did something that made Elena cry. She was lying in bed reading before sleep when the cat jumped up and walked across the bed, approached Elena's face, and began to headbutt her cheek repeatedly, a behavior that cat behaviorists call bunting, the cat's way of marking Elena as part of its family, of claiming her as belonging to its social group. The cat was also purring so loudly that Elena could feel the vibration against her face. Elena cried because she understood what was happening. This cat, which months ago had been struggling for survival on the streets, was now showing affection, was claiming her as family, was displaying the behaviors of a cat that felt safe and loved. The transformation was real. The rescue was working. Dr. Chen had suggested that once the cat was fully healed and showing stable behavior, it would be a good time to get it spayed or neutered and then look for an adoption. This was the agreed-upon process for foster homes: bring an animal to health, ensure it was ready for transition, then transfer it to a permanent home. Elena knew this was the plan. She had accepted this when she brought the cat in. But as weeks passed and the cat became integrated into her life, Elena found herself facing an unexpected complication. She didn't want to give the cat up. This awareness came as a surprise to Elena. She had never pictured herself as a permanent cat owner. She had thought of this as a rescue mission, a temporary intervention, a way to save a life that needed saving. But somewhere along the way, maybe when the cat first sat on her lap, maybe when the cat first purred, maybe when the cat headbutted her face and claimed her as family, Elena's intention had shifted. She made an appointment with Dr. Chen to discuss the spaying, and in that conversation, she voiced something she had barely admitted to herself. "I think I want to keep her," Elena said. "I know that's not what I originally planned. I know the idea was to rescue and rehome, but I don't think I can give her up." Dr. Chen smiled, a knowing smile that suggested this was not an uncommon development in the world of animal rescue. "What does the cat seem to want?" Dr. Chen asked. Elena thought about the question. She thought about the cat's behavior, its obvious attachment, its contentment in Elena's home. "I think she wants to stay," Elena said. "Then that's your answer," Dr. Chen said. "Sometimes rescue isn't about transferring an animal to someone else's permanent care. Sometimes rescue is about recognizing that you are the permanent person. You're the one she chooses. You're the one she's bonded with. That matters." The spaying surgery was scheduled and completed. The cat recovered well. And Elena made a decision that would ripple through both their lives. She was adopting this cat. Formally, legally, permanently. She named the cat Mira, a word meaning wonderful thing, or thing to be admired. It was a name that acknowledged both where the cat had come from and what it had become. The bridge between street and home had been built. The cat that arrived shivering in the rain had become Mira, a member of a household, a being whose well-being was now permanently entwined with a human's commitment. The transformation that had seemed impossible in those first terrified hours was now accomplished. The cat was no longer lost. It was found, claimed, loved, and finally, for the first time in its life, genuinely safe. But transformation is rarely as simple as a single moment of change. Within Mira's nervous system, the imprints of the street remained. She carried within her the memory of hunger, the startle response of a creature that had learned that the world was dangerous, the particular wariness that no amount of comfort could entirely erase. She would need time to fully integrate into domestic life. She would need patience from Elena as behavioral issues surfaced and had to be worked through. She would need to learn, over months and perhaps years, that the safety she now experienced was permanent, was real, was not going to be withdrawn. But for the first time, she had someone committed to her full transformation. Not just rescue, but full restoration. Not just saving from the street, but building into domesticity. Not just providing survival, but offering something closer to flourishing. The bridge that Elena had built by sitting on a wet sidewalk and offering tuna had led somewhere profound. It had led here, to a warm house, to a name, to a future that stretched ahead with possibility rather than threat. The cat that had once known only survival now knew something that had been entirely absent from its existence: the reality of being wanted, of being chosen, of being loved. The decision to adopt Mira had been made. The papers had been signed. Dr. Chen had provided Mira with a new medical record, now under Elena's ownership, documenting the journey from stray to domesticated cat. But adoption papers and medical records were merely the administrative acknowledgement of what had already begun, a fundamental restructuring of how Mira understood the world and her place within it. If the first weeks of rescue had been about physical healing, addressing parasites, treating infections, restoring nutritional balance, the subsequent months were about something more profound. They were about psychological healing, about the slow dissolution of fear, about learning to understand safety not as a temporary respite, but as a permanent condition. They were about the transformation that occurs when a creature begins to trust not just that it will survive, but that survival itself is no longer the primary concern. The house became Mira's sanctuary, though understanding it as such required time. The first month after adoption, Mira still operated from a framework of survival. She would eat with urgency despite having reliable access to food. She would hoard food in hidden corners, a behavior born of knowing hunger's reality. She would sometimes revert to eliminating outside the litter box, not from illness, but from anxiety, as though part of her still needed to mark territory in ways the streets had taught. Elena understood these behaviors not as failures, but as normal responses to trauma. She had done more research, had connected with online communities of people who fostered and adopted rescue animals. She had learned about the concept of decompression, the period during which a traumatized animal's true personality and needs gradually emerge as the acute stress responses fade. She had learned that patience was not just a virtue in this context, but a necessity, a fundamental component of healing. The house itself became a tool of healing. Elena had deliberately designed Mira's environment to facilitate comfort. She had placed multiple litter boxes throughout the home, the understanding being that having options reduced anxiety. She had created elevated spaces where Mira could perch and survey the environment, recognizing that cats feel safest when they can see the space they occupy. She had established quiet zones, the bedroom closet, a corner of the laundry room, where Mira could retreat when overwhelmed. She had left windows open to the outside world, but safely, so that Mira could observe the outside without being part of its chaos. Feeding became a ritual that communicated security. Elena fed Mira at the same time each day, in the same place, with the knowledge that predictability itself was healing. She would place the bowl down and speak softly. "Here you are, Mira. Food, safety, home." Words that the cat couldn't understand linguistically, but could comprehend emotionally, through tone and consistency. Over weeks, Elena noticed a gradual shift. Mira began to eat with less urgency. The hoarding behavior diminished. The cat started to recognize that food would appear regularly, that hunger was no longer imminent, that the world was arranged in her favor. The toys that Elena provided, feathers on strings, small balls, catnip mice, initially caused Mira confusion. The cat had not played in its entire life. The instincts for play were there, the pouncing motion, the stalking behavior, but they had always been directed toward actual prey, toward survival. Playing with toys was a luxury that street cats could not afford. Mira approached the toys with suspicion at first, as though they might be traps. But gradually, over weeks, she began to engage with them. She would bat at a feather string with movements that started tentative and became increasingly confident. She would stalk a toy mouse across the floor with the focus she had once reserved for catching rats. And slowly, very slowly, these hunting behaviors began to transform into something that could only be called play, activity for its own sake, for the joy of movement and engagement rather than for survival. There was a particular evening, about 2 months after adoption, when Elena witnessed the first moment of what she would characterize as pure play. Mira was chasing a feather toy that Elena was dragging across the living room floor. The cat pounced, missed, pounced again, and suddenly, in a movement that suggested something had shifted in Mira's understanding, the cat leaped high into the air, performed an almost gymnastic mid-air twist, and landed perfectly positioned to pounce again. It was a movement that suggested joy, exuberance, the kind of athletic exaggeration that animals only engage in when they are truly safe, when energy can be expended on pleasure rather than preserved for survival. Elena, watching this moment, felt tears come to her eyes. It was a small thing, a cat playing, but it was also an enormous thing. It represented Mira's nervous system finally recognizing that the world was safe enough for play, that energy could be expended on joy. It was a physical manifestation of healing. Around this same time, the affection that Mira showed Elena began to deepen and diversify. In the first weeks, Mira's contact had been somewhat perfunctory, an obligation, a ritual, an interaction that seemed necessary but somewhat mechanical. But now, the affection took on layers. Mira began to develop clear preferences for certain ways of being touched. She would solicit petting on the top of her head, but show irritation if Elena touched her belly. She would jump onto Elena's lap, sometimes seeking comfort, sometimes simply wanting proximity. She began to sleep on Elena's bed at night, gradually moving closer to Elena through the weeks, until eventually she was sleeping curled up directly against Elena's body, her purring creating a vibration that Elena could feel throughout the night. There were moments of profound connection. One evening, Mira approached Elena with what appeared to be intent. The cat climbed onto Elena's lap, settled into a comfortable position, looked directly into Elena's eyes, and began to purr. The purring intensified, became almost loud, and Mira's entire body vibrated with contentment. Elena, meeting the cat's gaze, found herself understanding that this was Mira communicating something beyond simple contentment. This was love, or something very close to it. Recognition that Elena was family, that this connection mattered, that Mira had chosen Elena as her person. The integration into the household extended beyond Elena herself. Elena had a best friend, Marcus, who had been supportive of the rescue and adoption from the beginning. Marcus had keys to Elena's apartment and frequently visited. In the first weeks, Mira had hidden whenever Marcus arrived. But gradually, as weeks became months, Mira began to tolerate Marcus's presence, then to seek it out. Eventually, Marcus became what Mira's body language suggested was another trusted human. Not as primary as Elena, but important part of the safe circle. Through Marcus, Mira encountered something else entirely: other humans. Marcus brought his nephew and niece one day, explaining that Elena wanted the cat to become comfortable with children, understanding that other families might be involved in Mira's future in ways Elena couldn't predict. The children, ages 6 and 8, were initially excited, loud, unpredictable in the ways that children are. Mira retreated to her safe zone. But Marcus had coached the children beforehand in how to approach a cat safely, and Elena had positioned herself to intervene if necessary. Over the course of the afternoon, Mira gradually emerged. By the end, the children were sitting quietly on the floor, and Mira was allowing them to pet her, even pushing her head into their hands in a way that suggested affection. This exposure to children was significant because it expanded Mira's world. The cat was learning that not all humans were Elena. Some were deeper-voiced, like Marcus. Some were higher-pitched and unpredictable, like the children. All of them could be part of Mira's safe circle, if introduced carefully, if given the chance. There was a moment, 3 months into the adoption, when Elena realized that Mira had integrated so fully into domestic life that traces of street behavior had become almost invisible. Mira was no longer hoarding food. She was no longer reversing to eliminate outside the box. She was no longer flinching at sudden movements, was no longer sleeping in a perpetual state of alert. The cat had learned to sleep deeply, to relax completely, to trust that sleep would not end with a predator attack or a human chase. But even as Mira integrated, moments of her past would surface unexpectedly. A loud noise, a siren, a car backfiring, the trash truck on collection day would sometimes trigger the old panic response. Mira would startle, her fur standing on end, and for a moment the terror of the streets would be visible in her eyes. These moments never lasted long. Elena would speak to her, would provide physical comfort if Mira would accept it, would remind the cat that she was safe, and Mira would gradually settle. But these moments were a reminder that trauma leaves marks that don't fully disappear. They become less frequent, less intense, but they remain. Around this time, Elena began to think about what life would be like if Mira were adopted by someone else. The legal adoption was final. Elena owned Mira. But the thought still prompted Elena to consider what kind of environment Mira needed long-term. Mira had come so far, had transformed so completely, that Elena recognized the importance of ensuring that the cat's future would be one of continued stability. Elena reflected on Mira's journey with new eyes. She thought about the street existence the cat had known, the hunger, the cold, the constant threat. She thought about what it meant that Mira had survived that existence. She thought about the accidents of rescue, that she, Elena, had happened to see the cat eating in her garden, had happened to be home when the storm came, had happened to decide that one life mattered enough to disrupt her own. She thought about how many other cats experienced that same street existence without encountering someone who chose to intervene. These reflections led to new insights. Elena began to understand that Mira's transformation was not just about individual rescue, but about what rescue represented. One cat saved was significant, but it was also statistically insignificant when compared to the thousands of cats living on streets. Yet at the same time, one cat fully transformed, fully healed, fully loved, that mattered enormously to that cat. That was the entire world to Mira. 4 months into the adoption, Elena made a decision. She contacted several cat rescue organizations and inquired about becoming a foster home. She explained that she had successfully adopted a rescued cat and wanted to do more. She explained that she had a house, resources, and most importantly, the experience of knowing what a cat needed to transition from street to home. The rescue organizations were enthusiastic. Within weeks, Elena had been trained and certified as a foster and was waiting for her first foster cat. This decision to become a foster home emerged from Elena's recognition that if everyone who adopted a rescue animal could foster one additional animal, the impact would be enormous. The rescue organizations were always full, with more cats arriving than could be placed. If homes like Elena's could serve as temporary sanctuaries for cats being prepared for adoption, it freed up resources at the shelter to save other cats. It was a way for Elena to multiply the impact of her rescue, to share the transformation she had witnessed in Mira with other animals in need. But before taking in another cat, Elena wanted to ensure that Mira was truly ready for the possibility of sharing her space. The cats that Elena would foster might be sick, might have behavioral issues, might have histories as complicated as Mira's. Introducing a new cat to Mira's carefully constructed sense of safety required care and consideration. Elena gradually tested the waters. She brought in a cat carrier, empty, and left it in the living room. Mira investigated it with curiosity rather than fear. She seemed to understand it as just an object in her space. Elena left it there for days, allowing Mira to become accustomed to it. Then, one day, Elena brought home a fostered cat, a young, healthy tabby named Sage, who had been found as a kitten but had grown up in a shelter without much human socialization. Rather than placing Sage directly in Mira's space, Elena set Sage up in a separate room, allowing the cats to sense each other under the door, to communicate through scent before any face-to-face encounter. This introduction process took days. Mira, showing curiosity without aggression, would sit by the closed door and listen to the sounds from the other side. Eventually, Elena opened the door, and Mira came face to face with Sage. There was initial hissing, a warning from each cat to establish boundaries. But neither cat was aggressive. Over the course of an hour, the cats began to ignore each other, which Elena understood as success. They didn't need to be friends, they simply needed to coexist peacefully. Over the next week, Mira and Sage slowly became comfortable sharing space. Sage, more cautious and less socialized than Mira, observed how Mira moved through the house, how Mira interacted with Elena, and gradually began to mirror those behaviors. By the end of Sage's 2-week foster period, the cats were actually playing together, engaging in the kind of hunting play that cats enjoyed with their feline companions. When Sage was adopted to a permanent home, Mira watched her leave with an apparent sense of loss. For a day or two, Mira seemed to search for her foster sibling, seemed to miss the presence of another cat. But Elena was there to provide comfort, and Mira soon adjusted to being solo again. The experience of fostering had confirmed something important. Mira had moved beyond her own trauma and fear sufficiently that she could share her space, could coexist with other cats, could serve as a model of stability for more frightened animals. She had become not just a survivor, but a guide. Her own transformation helping other cats understand that transformation was possible. Months had passed since that rainy night when Elena found Mira huddled and frightened. The cat that had arrived in Elena's house wet and terrified had become something else entirely. Confident, affectionate, playful, healed. The sanctuary that Elena had created through food and shelter and unconditional presence had done its work. Mira, despite the marks that trauma had left on her, had learned to flourish. She had learned that play was possible. She had learned that affection could be given freely and received without danger. She had learned that a human's consistent kindness could remake a life. And in learning those things, Mira had subtly shifted the question that had animated her existence. Once, the only question was, will I survive? Now, the question had become, how can I love and be loved? The answer to that question, Mira had discovered, was found in this house, in Elena's presence, in the safety of knowing that tomorrow would be like today, warm and fed and wanted. The awakening that had begun in those first terrified nights was now complete. Mira had woken to the possibility of a different kind of life. And in that awakening lay everything: hope, love, redemption, the beautiful proof that rescue was possible, that transformation was real, that the story of a stray cat could become a story of home. The world beyond Elena's house continued in all its complexity and chaos, indifferent to Mira's internal transformation. Winter had arrived fully by the time Mira had been adopted for 6 months. The temperatures dropped. Snow fell in the city where Mira had once struggled for survival, and Elena watched the cat observe the white precipitation through windows with apparent bemusement. Mira would press her face against the glass and stare at the snow as though trying to understand this phenomenon that had previously meant suffering. Now it simply meant that Elena kept the heat on, that there were warm blankets on the couch, that survival was no longer a concern, even as winter raged outside. But transformation, even one as profound as Mira's, is not linear. It does not progress smoothly from trauma to healing to complete recovery. Instead, it moves in cycles and spirals, with progress interrupted by setbacks, with moments of terror surfacing unexpectedly, with the past pressing forward into the present at moments of stress or vulnerability. The first significant setback came 6 months into Mira's adoption, triggered by something so ordinary that it almost went unnoticed. Elena was reorganizing her closet, removing winter clothes and bringing out summer clothes. She had stacked boxes on the floor, was moving things around, when she accidentally knocked over one of the boxes. It fell with a sudden, loud crash, and a cascade of clothes tumbled out across the floor. The noise triggered something primal in Mira. The cat, who had been napping peacefully on the bed, suddenly became rigid. Her body tensed, her eyes widened, and then, with a speed that Elena had not seen in months, Mira bolted from the bed and into the closet. But not the comfortable closet shelf where she liked to nap. Instead, Mira had somehow squeezed herself into the space between the closet wall and a hanging rod, a gap so narrow that Elena couldn't imagine how the cat fit. And there Mira stayed, completely motionless, barely visible, barely breathing, pressed as far back into the dark space as her body could fit. Elena, realizing immediately what had happened, stopped moving. She set down the items she was holding. She spoke softly. "It's okay, Mira. It was just a noise. You're safe. I'm here." But Mira didn't emerge. The cat remained in the crevice for hours, unmoving, unreachable. Elena sat on the bedroom floor, speaking occasionally in calm tones, but respecting the cat's need for the space and safety that hiding provided. She understood that this was a trauma response, that the loud noise had transported Mira's nervous system back to the streets, back to a world where sudden sounds meant danger, where hiding was the appropriate response to threat. Eventually, as evening approached, Mira emerged slightly. Elena could see the cat's eyes in the darkness, watching, assessing. Elena remained patient, made no move to grab the cat or force her out. Slowly, over the course of an hour, Mira extracted herself from the crevice and approached Elena. Elena gently picked the cat up and held her, feeling how Mira's entire body was trembling. That night, Mira stayed very close to Elena. She didn't seem angry or traumatized in a lasting way, but she was shaken, and it took days for her to fully return to her normal behavior. The incident revealed something important. Trauma does not disappear. It lives in the nervous system, can be triggered without warning, can transport a healed creature back to moments of fear. But equally important was what happened next. The setback didn't erase Mira's progress. It didn't make the cat revert to living in perpetual fear. Instead, it was a momentary regression that Mira recovered from within days. The cat learned, through experience, that the loud noise had not been followed by danger, that Elena was still there, that safety remained intact. The setback, in its way, became further evidence that safety was real. Over the subsequent weeks, Mira began to develop coping mechanisms for loud noises. Elena observed that when the sound of the vacuum cleaner triggered a startle response, Mira would hide briefly, but then, instead of staying hidden, would emerge and approach Elena for comfort. It was a subtle shift, a move from hide and hope to hide briefly, then seek reassurance. It suggested that Mira's nervous system was slowly rewiring, learning to distinguish between sounds that meant danger and sounds that simply meant a change in the environment. 2 months later, another challenge emerged, this time less obviously connected to trauma. Elena noticed that Mira was scratching more than usual, focusing on her ears and face. The scratching seemed compulsive, more than the normal grooming that cats engaged in. Elena examined Mira's ears and saw something that concerned her: visible redness and what looked like inflammation. A visit to Dr. Chen revealed a diagnosis of ear mites, parasitic creatures that had survived the initial parasitic treatment from months earlier and had re-emerged. The infection was treatable, but it would require medication, regular ear cleaning, and careful monitoring. For Mira, the return to the veterinary clinic triggered some anxiety. The car ride, the unfamiliar space of the clinic, the handling by Dr. Chen All of it was somewhat stressful for a cat that had finally begun to feel safe. But there was a difference now. When Mira had arrived at the clinic months earlier, she had been frightened and defensive. Now she was anxious but cooperative. She allowed Dr. Chen to examine her, seemed to understand that the examination was meant to help. And throughout the process, she looked at Elena as though asking, "Is this okay? Can I trust this?" And Elena's calm presence, her gentle words, provided the answer. Yes, this is safe. This is healing. The ear mite treatment required daily medication, eardrops applied to the canal, followed by ear cleaning. It was uncomfortable for Mira, and the cat didn't love the process. But Elena approached it as just another part of daily care, speaking to Mira throughout, explaining what was happening, providing comfort immediately after. And slowly, Mira began to accept it as a routine, unpleasant but necessary, part of being in Elena's care. During the 2 weeks of treatment, Elena reflected on how dramatically Mira's ability to handle medical care had changed. In the beginning, even simple handling had been challenging. Now, Mira could accept medical treatment, could tolerate discomfort, could trust that the discomfort was temporary and purposeful. This represented another layer of healing, the ability to submit to something unpleasant because she understood it was meant to help, because she trusted Elena's guidance, because she knew that after the unpleasantness came comfort and safety again. The ear mites cleared, the infection resolved. Mira's scratching decreased. But the experience had reinforced something important for Elena. Mira's healing was not a destination that could be reached and then left behind. It was an ongoing process. There would be medical issues to navigate, behavioral challenges to work through, moments when trauma surfaced. Rescue and adoption were not magical solutions that fixed a damaged animal into permanent wholeness. Instead, they created the conditions in which an animal could continuously heal, could continuously learn, could continuously grow stronger and more resilient. A month later, another challenge emerged, this one more behavioral than medical. One evening, Elena was preparing dinner when she noticed Mira exhibiting unusual behavior. The cat was pacing, seemed agitated, and was knocking items off the counter. The cup holder, a pen, a small plant. It was completely unlike Mira's normal calm demeanor. Elena stopped what she was doing and observed the cat more carefully. The pacing continued. Mira meowed several times, seemed distressed. Elena wondered if this was pain, illness, or something else. But the cat's eyes were bright. Her body language didn't suggest physical pain. It was something else. Anxiety, frustration, or possibly sexual frustration, Elena realized with a moment of comprehension. Dr. Chen had spayed Mira, but the procedure had been done months ago, and Elena knew that occasionally spaying didn't always address hormonal cycles in their entirety. Elena called Dr. Chen, who suggested that it could be a residual hormonal response or simply Mira being stimulated by something in the environment, perhaps the scent of another cat outdoors. Dr. Chen recommended monitoring and suggested that if the behavior persisted, they could discuss options. But actually, Dr. Chen suspected this was a temporary response that would resolve. It did. After a few hours of pacing and agitation, Mira calmed. The episode didn't repeat, but it had been uncomfortable to witness. Elena could see that the cat was distressed, and there was limited that Elena could do beyond providing comfort and waiting for the cycle to pass. This experience, too, became part of Elena's understanding of what rescue meant. It meant not just addressing the immediate trauma and damage from the street existence, but also navigating the ongoing complexities of living with a creature whose body and mind were still processing years of deprivation and stress. It meant accepting that complete cure was not always achievable, that sometimes the best that could be hoped for was management and acceptance. But there was also something important happening alongside these challenges. Mira's resilience was becoming evident. Each time the cat encountered a setback, a sudden noise, a medical issue, a moment of anxiety, Mira recovered. The cat had learned, through months of experience, that setbacks were temporary, that Elena would be there through them, that recovery was possible. The trauma survivor was becoming a resilient being. Marcus, Elena's friend, noticed the change when he visited around the 9-month mark of Mira's adoption. "She's different," he said, watching Mira play with a toy. "She still has that wariness in her eyes sometimes, but there's something else there now. Confidence, maybe?" Elena nodded. "I think she's learning that she's safe, not just in moments, but as a fundamental fact of her existence. The setbacks still happen, but they don't shake her the way they would have a few months ago." "Will they ever fully go away?" Marcus asked. "The anxiety, the trauma responses?" Elena considered the question. "I think some of it will always be there," she said, "but it doesn't have to control her life. She's learning to live with it, to manage it, to understand that the present is not the same as the past." This conversation, in its way, captured the essential truth of Mira's journey. The cat had survived tremendous hardship. That survival had left marks, nervous system responses, learned behaviors, moments of fear that could be triggered unexpectedly. But survival had also created strength, resilience, and ability to navigate difficulty. Mira carried both the scars and the strength. She was both more fragile and more resilient than she would have been if she had never experienced trauma. By the 9-month mark, Mira had become integrated into the structure of Elena's life in ways that seemed completely natural. Morning routines included Mira climbing onto Elena's lap while Elena drank coffee. Afternoon routines included playtime with toys or interaction with whatever foster cats Elena currently had in her care. Evening routines included Mira settling onto the bed, purring and sleeping curled against Elena's body. These routines, repeated daily, formed the scaffolding of safety and love that Mira's traumatized nervous system was gradually learning to rely on. But Elena also knew that trials would likely continue. The road from trauma to healing was not linear or complete. There would be more medical issues, more behavioral challenges, more moments when the past pressed forward into the present. But Elena had learned something crucial. Trials were not failures. They were part of the process. They were opportunities to reinforce the lesson that setbacks could be recovered from, that difficulties could be navigated, that no single moment or challenge could undo the transformation that was occurring. Mira, through all of this, was learning the same thing. The cat was learning resilience not as an abstract concept, but as lived experience. She was learning that adversity could be survived. She was learning that a human could be trusted, not because life was easy with that human, but because that human stood with her through difficulty. She was learning that healing was possible, not as a single achievement, but as a continuous process that could continue indefinitely. In the trials and setbacks, in the moments of regression and the subsequent recoveries, Mira's true transformation was taking place. Not the transformation from sick cat to healthy cat, that had occurred relatively quickly, but the deeper transformation from a creature operating entirely from trauma responses to a creature learning to live, to love, to trust, to flourish despite the marks that difficulty had left. That transformation was slow, was ongoing, and in many ways was the most important transformation of all. The turning point came gradually, so imperceptibly that Elena couldn't have identified the exact moment it occurred. But somewhere around the 10-month mark of Mira's adoption, something fundamental shifted. The cat was no longer primarily a creature navigating recovery. She had become, instead, a creature discovering joy. The feather toy that Elena had been dangling in front of Mira for months suddenly transformed from a source of confused investigation into an object of passionate interest. Mira had always known how to hunt. The instinct was embedded in her DNA, reinforced by months of actual hunting on the streets. But now, that hunting instinct merged with something new, the understanding that hunting could be fun, that the pursuit could be the point rather than mere means to survival. One afternoon, Elena was working at her desk when she noticed Mira's attention had fixed on the feather toy hanging from a string that Elena was trailing across the floor. What happened next was remarkable, not because it was unusual in terms of cat behavior, but because of the context. This was a cat that had known nothing but survival, and now she was playing, with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of a kitten discovering toys for the first time. Mira pounced. She missed. She stalked. She pounced again. And then, in a movement that seemed to defy the physical laws that constrained most animals, Mira leaped nearly 3 feet into the air, twisted her body in a way that looked almost impossible, and landed perfectly positioned to continue the hunt. It was a movement that Elena recognized instantly. This was joy. This was a cat whose nervous system had relaxed enough to expend energy on pure pleasure, whose body could move with the kind of athletic exuberance that was only possible when a creature was not operating from a framework of constant threat assessment. Elena stopped working and simply watched. She watched as Mira played with an intensity that suggested this was the most important thing in the world. She watched as the cat's personality emerged fully for the first time, not just the wariness giving way to affection, but the actual expression of an individual creature's preferences and quirks. Mira loved the feather toy, but was indifferent to the toy mouse. Mira loved being chased, but was less interested in chasing. Mira had particular times of day when she was most playful, early evening and early morning, and other times when she preferred rest. This emergence of play was connected to something else that was also emerging. Mira's unique personality. Over the months of recovery, Elena had gotten to know Mira as the rescued cat or the trauma survivor. But now, Mira was becoming simply Mira, an individual with tastes, preferences, moods, and quirks that had nothing to do with her history and everything to do with who she was as a being. Mira, Elena discovered, was an intellectual cat. She was fascinated by problems and puzzles. When Elena bought a puzzle feeder, a toy that required the cat to manipulate a mechanism to release treats, Mira spent hours investigating it, learning how it worked, eventually mastering it. She would approach the puzzle with obvious focus, would try different approaches, would persist until she figured out the solution. It suggested a mind that enjoyed engagement, that was stimulated by challenge. Mira was also, Elena discovered, particular about her preferences in ways that had nothing to do with survival. She preferred certain toys over others. She had a favorite spot on the couch that she would compete with Elena for. She liked certain kinds of treats, but turned her nose up at others. She was social with Marcus and with Elena, but maintained more distance from other visitors, as though she had decided that her circle of trusted humans was complete and didn't need expansion. Most remarkably, Mira began to engage in what cat behaviorists call play hunting, the kind of coordinated hunting activity that cats did not just for survival, but for pleasure and skill development. Elena would sometimes encounter Mira stalking imaginary prey, crouching behind furniture, leaping out at invisible targets. These hunting sessions seemed to have no purpose beyond the hunting itself, suggesting that Mira's brain had finally relaxed enough to engage in activities that were challenging and stimulating without being directly tied to survival. But the play that emerged most dramatically was social play, interaction between Mira and Elena that went beyond affection into active engagement. Elena discovered that Mira loved to play chase games. Elena would walk quickly through the house and Mira would pursue her, batting at her ankles, then running away, then chasing again. It was a game of mutual engagement, with both participants taking turns pursuing and being pursued. The game would often end with both of them stopping, both slightly out of breath, with Mira purring and Elena laughing. Through foster cats, Elena had further opportunities to witness Mira's capacity for play. When new foster cats arrived, typically frightened and traumatized like Mira had been, Mira would begin a careful process of engagement. She would play near the foster cat, but not directly with it initially. She would demonstrate that play was possible, was safe, was enjoyable. Gradually, the foster cat would become interested, and eventually, Mira and the foster cat would be playing together, chasing each other, batting toys, the kind of social engagement that helped traumatized cats understand that connection was possible. Elena observed that in these moments with foster cats, Mira seemed to be demonstrating something important. She seemed to be showing the foster cats, through her own example, that transformation was possible. Here was a cat that had been terrified and traumatized, and now was confident and playful. If the foster cat was watching carefully enough, they could see that this other cat had made the journey from fear to joy, and they could potentially make it too. One evening, Elena was playing with Mira when Marcus arrived for a visit. Marcus watched the cat's movements, the graceful pouncing, the quick turns, the moments of intense focus, and said something that struck Elena deeply. "She moves like a cat that's always been safe," he observed. "She doesn't move like a survivor. She moves like someone who's never known fear." Elena paused, considering the observation. It was true. Mira's movements had changed fundamentally. In the beginning, the cat's motion had been efficient, purposeful, always calculated for escape or response to threat. But now, Mira's movements were expansive, exuberant, sometimes inefficient in ways that suggested the freedom to be wasteful. She could leap high and miss her target and simply try again. She could engage in activities that had no survival value. She could move like a cat that belonged completely to a safe space. "She hasn't forgotten where she came from," Elena said slowly. "But she's learning how to move like she doesn't have to remember it all the time." This evolution of play and movement was connected to something else that Elena had been noticing: Mira's physical transformation. The cat was no longer skinny. She had developed a healthy weight that showed the musculature beneath her coat. Her coat, which had been matted and dull, had become glossy. The scars that had been visible in the beginning had faded. To someone looking at Mira now, without knowing her history, it would be impossible to tell that this cat had once been a stray, hungry and fighting for survival. But the most significant transformation was invisible. It was the rewiring of Mira's nervous system, the shift from a baseline of threat assessment to a baseline of safety. It was the physical manifestation of the understanding that the world was not primarily dangerous, that play was possible, that joy could exist, that life was not just about survival, but about living, engaging, enjoying, being present. The emergence of joy through play created a fascinating dynamic in Elena's understanding. She had always recognized that rescuing Mira was important, that saving the cat's life mattered. But she had thought about rescue primarily in terms of preventing harm, in terms of saving from death or suffering. Now she began to understand that rescue was also about enabling flourishing. It wasn't just that Mira wasn't starving anymore. It was that Mira could now experience joy. She could know pleasure. She could be engaged and interested in the world. She could live, not just survive. Around this same time, just after the 1-year mark of Mira's adoption, Elena began to reflect on what Mira had taught her about resilience and transformation. The cat's journey had been remarkable, but it had also been, in many ways, simple and straightforward. Provide food, provide medical care, provide safety, provide consistent, non-threatening human presence. Given these things over time, a traumatized creature would heal. It wasn't magic, it was just how living beings responded to consistent care and safety. But the implications of this understanding extended beyond Mira. If traumatized animals could heal with consistent care and safety, What did that say about the thousands of other animals suffering on streets? What did it say about the animals in shelters? What did it say about Elena's responsibility as someone who had learned what healing looked like? These thoughts led Elena to make a significant decision. She reached out to the rescue organization she fostered with and expressed interest in becoming more involved. She asked about volunteering opportunities, about ways she could contribute beyond fostering. The organization was enthusiastic, and within weeks, Elena had joined their board of directors. She was using her skills as a social worker to help develop programs that would increase adoption, to advocate for animal welfare policies, to push for community education about rescue and adoption. But even as Elena became more involved in broader rescue efforts, Mira remained at the center of her life. The cat had become not just a rescued animal, but a mirror through which Elena understood her own capacity for compassion, her own ability to make a difference, her own values and commitments. Mira's story was Elena's story. They were intertwined now. One evening, about 14 months into Mira's adoption, Elena was sitting on the couch with Mira curled up beside her when she felt the cat's weight shift. Mira climbed into Elena's lap, purring, and looked directly into Elena's eyes. The cat extended her paw and gently touched Elena's cheek with a movement that seemed almost deliberate, almost like a caress. Elena felt tears come to her eyes, not sad tears, but tears of profound gratitude. In that moment, she understood something important. Mira was not just a cat that Elena had saved. Mira had saved Elena too. The act of rescuing Mira had opened Elena to something she had been missing, the opportunity to commit completely to another being's well-being, to experience the profound satisfaction of watching someone move from trauma to joy, to understand that one life, fully lived and fully loved, was worth the investment. This recognition didn't change anything external about their relationship. Mira was still Mira, Elena was still Elena. Their daily routines remained the same, but something internal had shifted. Elena understood that she had not just adopted a cat, she had been transformed by that adoption. She had become someone who had learned what rescue meant, what commitment meant, what love meant in the most practical sense. And Mira, on the couch, purring, with paw touching Elena's cheek, seemed to understand something too. She seemed to understand that this human was hers, that this space was home, that play and affection and safety and love were the fundamental conditions of her existence now. The fear was still there somewhere, encoded in her nervous system, capable of surfacing in moments of sudden stress. But it was no longer the dominant note of her life. Joy, affection, play, engagement, these were the dominant notes now. The girl that had been living on streets, that had known only hunger and cold and threat, had become a cat that could leap high into the air in pure exuberance. She could play chase games with a human who loved her. She could purr so loudly that her entire body vibrated. She could trust that tomorrow would be warm and fed and full of affection. She could live, not as a survivor constantly assessing threat, but as a beloved being discovering joy. This was what transformation looked like. Not a single moment, not a dramatic reversal, but a gradual unfolding. Day by day, setback by setback, moment of connection by moment of connection, a being that had known only hardship had learned to know happiness. And everyone who witnessed it, Elena, Marcus, the other foster cats, the people who visited, understood they were witnessing something profound. They were watching the evidence that love, consistent and patient and generous, could remake a life. They were seeing, in the form of a small gray cat playing with a feather toy, what rescue actually meant. By the time Mira had been in Elena's home for 14 months, something fundamental had shifted in Elena's own understanding of what it meant to be a foster home. The first foster cat, Sage, had been placed with a permanent family. Several others had followed. Each transition had been bittersweet. Elena would grow attached to the foster cat during its stay, would invest in the process of helping it recover from trauma or illness, and then would release it to a new permanent home. It was the essence of foster care, temporary care for the purpose of permanent placement. But somewhere along the way, Elena had begun to wonder about the foster cats' lives after they left. She wondered if their adoptive families understood the journey the cats had been on. She wondered if the cats would thrive in their new homes. She wondered if the particular kinds of attention and care that the cats had learned to expect would continue. These questions had no answers, but they prompted Elena toward a new understanding of what foster work meant. One evening, about 16 months into Mira's adoption, Elena was discussing these concerns with Marcus over dinner. Mira was curled up on the nearby armchair, watching them with the calm awareness that was her normal state these days. "I'm thinking about changing my approach to fostering," Elena said. "Instead of just focusing on the immediate rescue and recovery, I want to make sure that the adoptive families understand what each cat needs. I want to follow up. I want to know if the placements are working." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. You've learned what works. You want to share that knowledge." "Exactly," Elena said. "And I'm realizing that part of what makes Mira such a success story is that I didn't just rescue her and place her. I committed to her permanently. That permanent commitment changed everything about how I approached her recovery." This realization became the foundation for a new initiative that Elena would develop with the rescue organization. She began working on what she called adoption support, a system where foster parents and the rescue organization would maintain contact with adoptive families for an extended period after adoption. They would provide guidance, answer questions, help troubleshoot behavioral issues, and ensure that the adoptive relationships remained strong and stable. But before Elena could fully develop this initiative, there was a moment that tested her own commitment to permanent adoption in ways she hadn't anticipated. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Elena received a call from Dr. Chen. The tone in the veterinarian's voice immediately signaled that something was wrong. "Elena, I need you to bring Mira in," Dr. Chen said. "Today, if possible. I've had a cancellation and want to examine her." "Is something wrong?" Elena asked, her heart rate accelerating. "Is she sick?" "I'm not sure," Dr. Chen said. "I got a call from Marcus. He was at your house this morning and noticed that Mira seemed to be limping on her back left leg. He said she didn't seem to be putting weight on it. I want to take some x-rays, make sure there's nothing serious." Elena's mind immediately went through the possibilities. Injury. Arthritis, though Mira was young, so unlikely. Infection. Something worse. She called work and explained that she had an emergency and would need to leave immediately. Within an hour, she had Mira in the carrier and was driving to the clinic. Dr. Chen's examination was thorough. She manipulated Mira's leg gently, asking the cat to bear weight on it, watching her movement. The examination didn't seem to reveal anything obviously wrong, but Dr. Chen wanted x-rays to be sure. They took the radiographs, and then there was a period of waiting while the images were processed. Elena sat in the exam room with Mira, speaking softly to the cat, trying to project calm even as anxiety was rising in her chest. She thought about all of Mira's journey, from street cat to rescued cat to this moment, with Elena sitting anxiously waiting for x-ray results. She thought about the possibility of something serious being wrong, about medical complications, about what she would do if Mira was severely ill. When Dr. Chen returned, her face was thoughtful. "The x-rays are interesting," she said. "There's no break, no obvious fracture. But there is something. It looks like early-stage arthritis in the joint. Nothing that's causing acute pain, but enough to make her favor the leg." Elena felt relief wash over her. Arthritis was manageable. It wasn't a death sentence. It was something that could be treated with medication if necessary, managed with care. "It could be residual damage from her street life," Dr. Chen explained. "Injuries that didn't heal properly, combined with the nutritional deficiencies she had. Or it could just be something she's genetically predisposed to. Either way, it's not urgent, but we should monitor it. If it gets worse, we can discuss pain management options. Elena nodded, absorbing the information. What does this mean for her quality of life? Honestly, not much, Dr. Chen said. Cats are remarkably good at adapting to minor discomfort. She might have difficulty with high jumps occasionally. She might prefer to move a bit more slowly, but with appropriate medication if needed, she should be fine. This isn't something that will significantly impact her lifespan or her daily comfort. Driving home, Elena processed the emotions of the experience. The fear had been real. The possibility that something serious might be wrong with Mira had genuinely frightened her. But underlying that fear was something important, the absolute certainty that she would do whatever was necessary for Mira. Expensive treatment, ongoing medication, lifestyle modifications, none of it would have been negotiable. Mira's well-being came first. That clarity of commitment was something Elena held on to even as the anxiety gradually faded. But the experience also highlighted something that Elena had been increasingly thinking about. The reality of permanent adoption meant accepting that a creature would age, would potentially develop health issues, would eventually die. It meant committing not just to the good times, but to the entire arc of life, including decline and loss. When Elena had first rescued Mira, the cat had been young and relatively healthy, despite her trauma. Mira could potentially live another 10 to 15 years. Elena was making a commitment that would span decades. This acceptance of commitment became even more relevant as Elena continued her work with foster cats and developed relationships with adoptive families. One particular adoption became a window into both the power and complexity of permanent placement. Elena had been fostering a cat named Jasper, an older male who had been found abandoned in a parking lot. Jasper was a gentle creature but had significant health issues, including diabetes. His care required insulin injections twice daily, careful diet management, and regular veterinary monitoring. Most potential adopters had been scared away by the medical complexity. But then a family had come along, a middle-aged couple whose children had grown and left. They had seen Jasper's profile, had learned about his medical needs, and had decided they were willing to take him on. The adoption had been successful, but Elena found herself staying in close contact with the family. She had given them detailed instructions about insulin administration, had provided them with Dr. Chen's contact information, and had asked them to keep her updated. Over the months after adoption, Elena received regular emails from the family. Photos of Jasper in his new home, updates about his blood sugar management, stories about how he had become beloved by everyone in the household. One email in particular moved Elena deeply. The family's teenage daughter, visiting from college, had written to Elena directly. "I wanted to tell you what Jasper has meant to our family. My parents adopted him during a difficult time. My mom was dealing with some health issues, and my dad was stressed about her well-being. But taking care of Jasper, learning how to give him his injections, watching him improve and thrive, it gave them something to focus on together, something that made them feel like they were making a difference. Jasper saved them as much as they saved him." Reading this email, Elena understood something crucial about adoption and rescue. It wasn't a one-directional act. It wasn't about a human saving an animal. It was about connection, about the way that caring for another being could transform the caregiver. Mira had saved Elena. Jasper had saved his adoptive family. This was the real power of rescue, the mutual transformation that occurred when a human committed to caring for an animal. But this understanding also made Elena more careful about the foster cats she took in and more thoughtful about placements. She began to think deeply about what each cat needed, about what kind of home would best support their continued healing. She stopped thinking about foster care as simply getting cats healthy enough for adoption and started thinking about it as understanding each cat deeply enough to know who their perfect permanent family would be. This more thoughtful approach meant that sometimes foster cats stayed longer than expected. Elena would have a cat that she thought was ready for adoption, but when she would assess potential families, she would realize that none of them were quite right. So the cat would stay, and Elena would wait for the right match. This happened with a cat named Shadow, a young, black female who had been found in a warehouse and had severe socialization challenges. Shadow didn't like most humans. She was anxious, prone to hiding, difficult to handle. Elena could have placed her with someone willing to take on a challenging cat. But Elena kept waiting, feeling that Shadow needed someone specific, someone patient enough to move at Shadow's pace, someone willing to allow the cat years rather than months to fully integrate. The right family eventually came along, a retired woman named Dorothy who had previously owned cats and who had the time and patience that Shadow needed. Dorothy came to Elena's home multiple times to meet Shadow before adoption, allowing the cat to become comfortable with her presence. When they finally did adopt Shadow, it was because both Elena and Dorothy understood that this was the right match, that Dorothy's home and Shadow's needs aligned perfectly. This patient, careful approach to adoption began to define Elena's foster work. She was no longer focused on how quickly she could move cats through her home and into permanent placement. Instead, she was focused on finding the perfect permanent home for each cat, even if that meant they stayed in her foster care longer, even if it meant saying no to families that weren't quite right. Mira, watching this process unfold over months, seemed to understand something about what Elena was doing. The interactions between Elena and the foster cats, the careful transitions, the follow-up contact with adoptive families, all of it demonstrated that Elena was invested in lasting success, not just immediate rescue. And perhaps Mira, with her own history of being seen and valued by Elena, understood that this was what love looked like, not just saving someone from immediate danger, but staying invested in their long-term well-being. By the 18-month mark, Elena had successfully placed 11 foster cats in permanent homes and had maintained contact with all of them. She had documentation of their success, photos of them playing with new families, updates about their behavior, stories about how they had transformed. She had compiled this into a portfolio that she used to show potential adoptive families what was possible, what rescue could mean, what commitment to an animal could create. But through all of this work, through fostering, through adoption, through follow-up support, Mira remained Elena's own cat, her own permanent commitment, her own evidence of what rescue could accomplish. Mira was Elena's North Star, the constant reminder of why this work mattered, of what was possible when a human chose to see an animal's need and responded with full commitment. One evening, looking at photos of Mira from the time of rescue and photos of Mira now, healthy, confident, playful, Elena thought about all the foster cats she had placed. She thought about the families they lived with, about the daily care and affection they received, about the way they had moved from trauma or abandonment into belonging. And she thought about how each of those successes was possible because Elena had learned, through Mira, what rescue meant. The waiting was over. Not the waiting for adoption, Mira was already where she belonged. But the waiting for understanding, for clarity about what her own role in rescue meant. Elena had found her calling. She had learned that rescue was not a single act, but a commitment. That transformation was possible, but required patience. That one cat, fully loved and fully supported, could change an entire life, then multiply that change into the lives of many other cats. The perfect match had already been found. Elena and Mira, perfectly suited to each other, each healing the other, each teaching the other about love and commitment and the possibility of transformation. Though Mira was already Elena's permanent cat, the structure of her rescue and recovery had involved what rescue organizations called adoption applications, formal requests from potential adopters who wanted to take cats into their homes.
Elena had never actually released Mira to someone else, had chosen instead to keep her. But the process itself had been valuable, had clarified what Elena was looking for when considering who might take a rescued animal. Now, as Elena worked more deeply with the rescue organization and as her role expanded to include matching foster cats with adoptive families, she found herself reviewing adoption applications constantly, assessing whether potential families were truly ready for the commitment that a rescued cat required. The work of matching took many forms. Sometimes it was obvious. A family would come in looking for a cat, and Elena would immediately recognize that they would be perfect for a particular animal. But other times, the matching process required careful consideration, multiple meetings, and sometimes even the decision to say no to families that weren't quite right, no matter how eager they were to adopt. This was how Elena met the Ramirez family, though the meeting didn't begin as an adoption consideration. Instead, it began as something else, a community education event. Elena had been working with the rescue organization to develop a program where representatives would visit schools, community centers, and other public spaces to talk about rescue and adoption. The goal was to change cultural attitudes about adoption, to help people understand that rescuing an animal was a meaningful choice, and to encourage families to adopt rather than purchase from breeders or pet stores. The community center event was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon. Elena had brought materials and photos documenting several rescue stories, including extensive documentation of Mira's transformation. She set up a display in the community center's main room and prepared to spend the afternoon talking to families about rescue. The Ramirez family arrived mid-afternoon. There were 4 of them: Maria and David, the parents, and their 2 children, Sophia, age 7, and Marcus Jr., age 10. They approached Elena's display with the cautious interest of people who were curious but not yet committed. David was reading one of the pamphlets about adoption requirements when Sophia tugged on his sleeve and pointed at the photos of Mira. "Look," Sophia said, "this cat is so pretty. Where is she?" Elena smiled and began to tell the story. She showed the before photos, Mira wet and frightened, her ribs showing prominently, her fur matted. She showed the after photos, Mira healthy and confident, playing with toys, sleeping peacefully on a couch. She explained how Mira had been a stray cat, how she had been rescued, how her transformation had taken months of patient care. As Elena told the story, she watched the family's reactions. Maria was clearly moved by the narrative, her eyes lingering on the before photos. Sophia was fascinated by the transformation, asking Elena detailed questions about how Mira had changed. David seemed more reserved but interested. Young Marcus asked practical questions. Where does she sleep? What does she eat? How do you train a cat? "We're actually thinking about getting a cat," Maria said to Elena. "My kids have been asking for a pet, and we've been considering adoption. But I wasn't sure. I thought rescue cats might have behavioral problems or health issues." Elena seized this as an opportunity. She began to explain what rescue actually meant, what the process was like, what kind of support families received. She explained that rescue cats were not inherently problematic. They simply had experienced trauma or abandonment and needed homes where their history would be understood and respected. "Would you like to visit the shelter?" Elena asked. "We have several cats right now who might be good fits for a family with children. Some are young, some are older, some are already quite socialized and just need a home, while others need more time to adjust." The family agreed, and 2 weeks later, they visited the rescue organization's facility. Elena showed them around, introducing them to various cats. There was Poppy, a young orange tabby who was already very social. There was Cornelius, an older gray cat who was calm and gentle. There was a young black kitten named Pepper, who was playful and interactive. The children were drawn to Pepper, the kitten. Pepper was everything that a child might find engaging in a cat. Small, playful, responsive to attention. The kitten would bat at their fingers, would chase toys, would pounce with apparent enthusiasm. Sophia and Marcus Jr. were captivated. But Elena, watching the family interaction, was thinking more carefully. She had learned, through her experience with Mira and her work with foster cats, that sometimes what was immediately attractive was not what was truly right. Children were often drawn to the most active, the most playful, the most responsive cats. But children also required a cat that was patient, that could tolerate a child's sometimes rough handling, that would be stable and predictable. "Pepper is wonderful," Elena said carefully. "But can I show you another cat? I think you might want to consider Poppy as well before you decide." Elena brought out Poppy, the orange tabby. Unlike Pepper's enthusiastic engagement, Poppy's approach was calmer, more measured. The cat would allow pets, would interact with the children, but would also take breaks, would maintain boundaries. Poppy was, in Elena's assessment, more suited to a family with children because Poppy had the emotional regulation to handle a child's varying moods and energy levels. "I want Pepper," Sophia said immediately, with the clarity of a child's preference. "Pepper is wonderful," Elena said, "but I want you to understand what each cat needs. Pepper is young and has lots of energy. She might get frustrated with children sometimes, or she might accidentally scratch because she's so playful. Poppy is gentler, more patient. For a first cat with kids, Poppy might be the better match." Maria and David exchanged a look. Elena could see them processing this information, trying to balance what their children wanted with what Elena was suggesting might be best. "Why don't you think about it?" Elena said. "Come back next week if you want. Spend more time with both cats. Make sure this is the right decision for your whole family." The family left without committing to an adoption that day. But Elena was impressed by their thoughtfulness, their willingness to consider Elena's guidance rather than simply go with their children's immediate preferences. A week later, they called Elena and asked if they could adopt Poppy. The adoption process from there was straightforward. Elena verified their references, confirmed that they had the financial means to care for a cat, discussed the cat's needs and the family's expectations. She emphasized that Poppy had not come from the streets. She had been in the shelter since being surrendered by a previous owner, so she was already somewhat socialized. But she would still need time to adjust to a new home. On adoption day, the family came to pick up Poppy. Elena had prepared adoption materials for them. Information about cat care, feeding guidelines, behavioral resources, and, importantly, Elena's own contact information with a note, "Please reach out if you have any questions or concerns. I'm here to support you." As the family was leaving with Poppy in a carrier, Sophia turned back to Elena and asked, "Will we ever see Mira, the cat from the pictures?" Elena knelt down to meet Sophia's eyes. "Mira is my own cat," she explained. "She lives at my house. But maybe sometime, if your family comes back to visit the shelter, you could see pictures of her and hear more of her story." Sophia nodded seriously. "I hope she's really happy," the child said, "after everything she went through." "She is," Elena said. "She's very happy. That's what rescue means, giving someone a second chance at happiness." Over the following weeks, Elena maintained contact with the Ramirez family. She sent them a follow-up email asking how Poppy was adjusting. Maria responded with a detailed message about how Poppy had integrated into their home. The cat had been cautious for the first week, but had gradually emerged from hiding. Now, a month after adoption, Poppy was sleeping on Sophia's bed at night, was playing with toys, was becoming part of the family. Reading this email, Elena felt deep satisfaction. This was what she had been working toward, not just placing cats, but ensuring that the placements were successful, that families understood what they were taking on, that rescue cats ended up in homes where they would truly flourish. But the story didn't end with Poppy's adoption. 3 months later, Elena received a call from Maria. "We've been thinking," Maria said without preamble. "Poppy has been so wonderful. She's brought so much joy to our family, and we've been following your work with the rescue organization. We want to help. We're wondering if we could foster a cat, take in a cat that needs rehabilitation before adoption, like you do." Elena, surprised and pleased, began to discuss what fostering would entail. She explained the commitment, the emotional difficulty of temporary care, the potential challenges of taking in a traumatized animal. She wanted to make sure the family understood what they were signing up for. "We understand," David said, having taken the phone from his wife. "We see what you do. We see what's possible. We want to be part of it." Within 2 weeks, the Ramirez family had taken in their first foster cat, a young female named Tiger, who had been found injured and who needed several weeks of recovery and socialization before being ready for adoption. Elena visited regularly to check on Tiger's progress and to guide the family through the fostering process. What Elena observed over those weeks was something that she had seen before but never tired of witnessing: the way that an act of rescue could expand. One family had adopted one cat. That adoption had gone well. Now the family wanted to foster. They were learning what rescue meant. They were becoming part of the solution rather than remaining outside of it. When Tiger was eventually adopted to a permanent home after her 6-week foster stay, the Ramirez family didn't stop. They asked to foster another cat and another. Within a year, they had fostered 5 cats, and all 5 had been successfully placed in permanent homes. Elena documented all of this. She took photos of the Ramirez family with each foster cat. She collected testimonials about what fostering meant to them. She used their story as an example in her community education presentations. Here was a family that had started knowing nothing about rescue, had adopted one cat, and had become active participants in rescue work. Sophia, now 8 years old, had become particularly invested in the work. She had created drawings of the foster cats, had helped her mother write descriptions of the cats for adoption profiles, had even attended one community event where she talked about what it was like to help rescue animals. One day, while Elena was visiting the Ramirez home to check on a foster cat, Sophia asked Elena the question that Elena had been waiting for. "Can I meet Mira, your cat? I want to see if she's really as nice as you said." Elena smiled. "I think that's a wonderful idea," she said. She made arrangements, and the following Saturday, the Ramirez family visited Elena's home. Mira, who by this point had been Elena's cat for nearly 2 years, had become very comfortable with visitors. She didn't hide or show anxiety. Instead, she simply observed the new humans from a position of safety, on the back of the couch, in a place where she could see everything but didn't have to engage if she didn't want to. Sophia approached slowly, understanding from previous experience with Poppy and the foster cats how to approach a cat respectfully. She held out her hand and let Mira sniff. After investigating Sophia's scent, Mira allowed the child to pet her. "She's so soft," Sophia said with wonder, "and she looks so happy." Elena, watching the interaction, saw something that moved her deeply. She saw Sophia understanding, through this interaction with Mira, the full arc of rescue. This was the cat that had been on the streets, that had been starving and sick and frightened. And now she was healthy, was happy, was safe. She was the proof that transformation was possible, that rescue worked, that every cat that was saved from the streets had the potential to become this, a loved, healthy, happy creature. "She's happy because people cared for her," Elena told Sophia. "Because someone saw her suffering and decided to help. Because she's been loved and supported." "Like Poppy," Sophia said, making the connection. "Poppy was in the shelter, and now she's happy because we're taking care of her." "Exactly," Elena said. "That's what rescue means." In that moment, Elena understood something crucial about the ripple effects of rescue. Mira's individual story had led to Elena's involvement with the rescue organization. Elena's involvement had led to community education. The community education had reached the Ramirez family. The Ramirez family's adoption of Poppy and decision to foster had already led to the rescue of multiple other cats. And now, Sophia, a child who understood rescue through her own experience, would carry that understanding forward into her own future. She might make choices about animals, might advocate for rescue, might teach other children what she had learned. The meeting of two worlds, Mira's world of rescue and permanent care, and the Ramirez family's world of adoption and fostering, had created something larger than either world alone. It had created a network of care, a circle of rescue and transformation that would continue to expand, would continue to save lives. Mira, sitting on her favorite spot on the couch, being petted by Sophia, seemed to understand none of this complexity. She simply existed in her moment, warm, safe, loved, surrounded by humans who cared for her. But her existence, her transformation, her presence in this room was the foundation upon which everything else was built. She was the evidence, the proof, the living example that rescue was worth doing. To understand what it meant for a cat to come home, truly come home, requires understanding what home was not. Home was not simply a physical location. Home was not just a shelter from weather or a guaranteed source of food. Home was a state of being where a creature understood at the deepest level of consciousness that it belonged to a place and that place belonged to it. Home was trust made manifest in bricks and furniture and the particular quality of light that fell through familiar windows at familiar times of day. For Mira, the journey to such a home had been long and circuitous. She had lived in the warehouse where she was born, a space that had been neither refuge nor home, but simply a starting point, an accident of birth. She had lived in the streets, a vast territory with no walls that could contain her, no roof that could shelter her, no permanence that could anchor her. She had lived in Elena's house as she recovered, a sanctuary, but also a space in transition, a place she inhabited but did not yet understand as permanent. And now, more than 2 years after her rescue, Mira lived in Elena's home not as a refuge but as home itself, the center of her universe, the space where her identity was rooted. But there were other cats for whom the threshold, that moment of arriving at a permanent home, was still ahead. And in the work that Elena was doing with the rescue organization, she found herself increasingly focused on that threshold moment, on understanding what made it successful, on supporting families through the transition. One particular case became a teaching moment for Elena and the families she worked with. The cat was named Cassandra, and her story was more complicated than most. Cassandra had been found in an abandoned building, part of a colony of feral cats living in the ruins. Unlike some of the other cats in the colony, Cassandra had been caught and brought to the rescue organization. She was young, probably no more than 3 years old, but her entire existence had been lived wild, outside of human care. She had never been in a house. She had never used a litter box. She had never been touched consistently by a human. She was feral not through behavioral issues, but through the simple fact that she had never been socialized to human presence. The rescue organization had done initial medical work on Cassandra, vaccinations, spaying, basic health assessment. But the real work of helping Cassandra transition from feral to domestic was only beginning. Elena took Cassandra as a foster, understanding that this particular cat would need extensive time and patience before being ready for adoption. The first weeks with Cassandra were challenging. The cat refused food when Elena was nearby, as though the presence of a human negated any benefit the food might provide. Cassandra hid constantly, preferring the space under the couch to any other location. She would hiss and strike at Elena if the human approached too closely. She exhibited behaviors that, to someone unfamiliar with feral cats, might have suggested aggression. But Elena understood these behaviors for what they were, fear responses from a creature that had never learned to trust humans. Elena's approach to Cassandra was fundamentally different from her approach to Mira or even to most other foster cats. With Cassandra, Elena did not attempt to force contact or to accelerate socialization. Instead, Elena simply made her presence consistently available without demand. She would sit in the room where Cassandra was hiding. She would leave food and water. She would speak softly. But she would not try to pet the cat, would not try to force interaction, would not interpret Cassandra's avoidance as rejection. Weeks passed. Mira, interestingly, became an unexpected tool in Cassandra's socialization. Mira would move about the house, purring, interacting with Elena normally, and Cassandra would observe this from her hiding places. Cassandra was seeing, through Mira's example, that humans could be approached, that physical contact was possible, that trust was a thing that existed. It was a subtle lesson, but a powerful one.
Slowly, over many weeks, Cassandra's behavior shifted. The cat began to eat when Elena was in the room, though still with obvious anxiety. She began to spend less time under the couch and more time in other areas of the house. She began to acknowledge Elena's presence without immediate flight or aggression.
3 months into Cassandra's foster stay, Elena had a breakthrough moment. She was sitting on the couch reading when Cassandra approached, not close, but closer than before. The cat sniffed the air in Elena's direction, as though trying to gather information about this human. Elena remained still, did not reach out, simply allowed Cassandra to approach at her own pace. Cassandra moved closer, closer, and then, barely, the cat extended her paw and touched Elena's hand. It was the lightest possible contact, but it was contact the cat had initiated. Elena, understanding the significance of this moment, did not move. She allowed her hand to be touched, and slowly, carefully, Cassandra moved closer still. And then, slowly, Elena began to stroke the cat's side with a single finger, the lightest possible touch. Cassandra didn't run. The cat remained, receiving this gentle touch for nearly a minute before backing away. But she had allowed it. She had allowed physical contact. The threshold had been crossed. From this moment forward, Cassandra's progress accelerated. The cat began to actively seek Elena out for brief periods of contact. She began to play with toys. She began to vocalizations, not the constant yowling of a feral cat in distress, but actual meows, as though learning to communicate with the human in ways that humans understood. She began to use the litter box reliably. She began to eat the food Elena provided with less obvious anxiety. 6 months into Cassandra's foster stay, Elena felt that the cat was ready to transition to a permanent home. But finding the right permanent home for Cassandra was crucial. Most potential adopters wanted cats that were already social, already cuddly, already comfortable with human interaction. Cassandra was still developing these capacities. She was still cautious, still reserved, still very much a cat learning to trust. Elena went through numerous adoption applications and rejected all of them. The families seemed nice, but Elena understood that Cassandra needed specific things. She needed an adopter who was patient, who understood that trust was not guaranteed, who would not be disappointed if the cat didn't immediately become an affectionate lap cat. She needed someone who could appreciate Cassandra's gradual opening up as a victory rather than a failure. The right family came along eventually. A man named Kevin, who had previously owned an outdoor, semi-feral cat that he had very slowly brought into a life of trust and domesticity. Kevin understood the process. Kevin was willing to be patient. Kevin had successfully done this before, which meant he had realistic expectations about what time and consistency could accomplish. Before adoption, Elena arranged for Kevin to visit several times, to meet Cassandra in Elena's home, to begin building a relationship before taking the cat into his own space. During these visits, Elena observed carefully. She watched Cassandra's responses to Kevin, watched Kevin's responses to Cassandra, observed the small, incremental moments of trust building. When adoption day arrived, Elena prepared Cassandra for the transition much as she had prepared Mira years earlier. She had a carrier ready, she had written detailed care instructions for Kevin, she had provided information about the specific ways that Cassandra needed to be approached, what behaviors meant what, how to support the cat's continued development. But the real preparation happened in the conversation Elena had with Kevin in those final moments before he took Cassandra home. "She's going to be frightened at first," Elena told Kevin. "This is a new space. She's only just begun to trust in my home. In your home, that trust is going to regress temporarily. She'll hide. She might not eat right away. This is normal. This is not failure. Your job is to create the conditions for her to feel safe. Give her time. Give her space. Let her come to you." "What if she never fully opens up?" Kevin asked. "What if she stays scared?" "Then you'll have a cat who is slowly learning to trust," Elena said. "And that's enough. That's actually everything. Not every rescue cat becomes a cuddly lap cat, but every rescue cat can learn that some humans are safe. That's success." Kevin nodded, absorbing this. He carried Cassandra's carrier to his car, and Elena watched as he drove away. She had done all she could. The threshold had been crossed. Cassandra was going to her permanent home. But Elena's investment in Cassandra didn't end with adoption. She maintained regular contact with Kevin. She sent follow-up emails asking how Cassandra was adjusting. She provided guidance when Kevin reported specific behaviors or challenges. She celebrated the small victories. The first time Cassandra ate while Kevin was in the room. The first time the cat approached Kevin seeking contact. The first purr. 3 months after adoption, Kevin sent Elena a photo. Cassandra was sitting on Kevin's lap, had the appearance of being completely relaxed, was purring audibly in the photo, though of course Elena couldn't hear it. The email read, "I wanted to send you this because I wanted you to know that what you said was right. A few weeks ago, I didn't think this was possible. She was so scared. But she's learning. She's slowly understanding that she's safe, and now she sits with me like this. I just wanted to thank you for helping me understand what patience was needed. This is the most rewarding relationship I've ever had with a cat." Reading this email, Elena cried, not from sadness, but from the profound satisfaction of witnessing a successful transformation. Cassandra, who had been born wild and frightened, who had never learned to trust humans, had now crossed the threshold into a permanent home where she was learning love. It was slow. It was gradual. It might never be complete in the way that a cat born into human care might open up, but it was real. It was transformation. This work with Cassandra became a model for Elena's understanding of what rescue meant for the most traumatized animals. It was not about quick fixes. It was about time, patience, consistency, and most importantly, about adjusting expectations to match the reality of what an animal had experienced. Some cats would become loving, affectionate companions. Others would learn to tolerate human presence, to accept care, to exist in human homes without fear overwhelming them. Both were successful outcomes. Both deserved to be celebrated. Over the next year, Elena worked with multiple cats like Cassandra, animals that had been wild or feral, that had never been socialized to humans, that seemed impossible to domesticate. But through patience, consistency, and careful matching with the right adoptive families, all of them crossed the threshold. All of them found homes. All of them began, in their own time, to learn what trust meant. Mira watched these processes unfold in Elena's home. She observed foster cats arriving frightened and traumatized, gradually opening up, eventually leaving for permanent homes. She had become, in her own way, an ambassador for transformation. Newer foster cats saw Mira moving confidently through the house, playing with toys, receiving affection from Elena, and they understood, perhaps without knowing they understood, that such transformation was possible. By the second anniversary of Mira's adoption, Elena had placed 52 cats in permanent homes through her foster work. 52 animals that had been living on the streets, in shelters, in situations of abandonment or neglect, now had homes. They had humans committed to their welfare. They had the opportunity to learn that life could mean more than survival. Some of them had crossed the threshold easily, like Mira. Others had required months of patience, like Cassandra. But all of them had crossed. And standing at the center of this expanding circle of rescue was Mira, healthy, happy, completely at home in Elena's space, a living reminder of what was possible when someone saw an animal in need and chose to help. Mira had crossed the threshold from street to sanctuary, from fear to trust, from survival to flourishing. And in crossing that threshold, she had become the foundation upon which everything else was built. The integration of a traumatized animal into a new permanent home was not a single moment, but a process, a gradual unfolding of understanding, adaptation, and mutual learning between human and animal. Elena had learned this through Mira's own integration, but had learned it more deeply through her work fostering cats with varying degrees of trauma and socialization challenges. Each cat integrated differently. Each cat required different things, but all of them, without exception, required time. When a cat arrived at its permanent home, the first days were critical. The home was a new territory, new smells, new sounds, new architecture that required learning. The cat's nervous system would be in a state of heightened alert, trying to make sense of this entirely new space. Most cats, especially those with trauma histories, would hide. They would find small spaces, under the couch, in a closet, behind furniture, and they would stay there, observing, assessing, trying to determine if this new territory was safe. This hiding phase was not something to worry about or try to interrupt. It was part of the process. The cat was doing important work, learning the space, calibrating its sense of safety, understanding the patterns of the humans who lived there. Elena had learned to counsel adoptive families to give their cats this space, to understand that the hiding was not failure but progress. Most of Elena's success as a foster coordinator and adoption counselor came from this simple wisdom, understanding what cats needed and helping human families provide it. She worked with the rescue organization to develop detailed adoption guides for each cat, documents that explained the cat's history, its particular needs, and the specific strategies that had worked in Elena's foster home. The guide for Cassandra, for example, included detailed instructions. Cassandra came from a feral colony and is still learning to trust humans. She needs time and space. The first week she will likely hide. This is normal. Leave her alone to adjust. Place food and water in different areas. Do not try to pet her or force interaction. She will emerge when she feels safe. Once she does, let her approach you. Let her set the pace of contact. Movement and consistency will help her learn that you are safe. Adopters who read these guides and followed the instructions reported significantly higher success rates. They understood what they were getting into. They had realistic expectations. They were prepared to support the cat's gradual integration rather than expecting immediate bonding. But integration was not just about the cat's adaptation to the home. It was also about the cat becoming integrated into the family's daily life. And this required a different kind of work, the mundane, daily acts of care that, over time, wove the cat into the fabric of the household. This integration happened through routines. A family would establish a pattern, feeding the cat at particular times, allowing the cat to follow them through the house at certain hours, setting up play sessions. These routines, repeated day after day, month after month, created a structure within which the cat could relax. The cat learned that at 8 in the morning, food would appear. At evening, the human would be available for play. At night, it was time to settle down. Within this structure, predictability, the cat's nervous system gradually registered that the environment was safe, that needs would be met, that the future was not uncertain. Elena documented this process carefully through her work with adoptive families. She had families send her updates, photos at 1 week post-adoption, 2 weeks, 1 month, 3 months. Through these photos, Elena could see the integration happening. The first photos showed cats hidden, barely visible, clearly stressed. 2-week photos showed cats emerging slightly, sitting in more exposed locations but still appearing wary. 1-month photos showed cats beginning to interact with family members. 3-month photos showed cats that looked like they had always belonged there, relaxed, confident, integrated into family life. One particular family, the Chens, who had adopted a cat named Moonlight, sent a series of photos that beautifully documented integration. Moonlight had arrived at their home traumatized, having been rescued from a hoarding situation where she had lived with more than 50 other cats, barely receiving care. The first photo showed Moonlight barely visible under a bed. By the third photo, taken 3 weeks later, Moonlight was sitting on the back of the couch, though still looking wary. By 6 weeks, Moonlight was curled up on a child's lap. By 3 months, Moonlight was asleep on the parent's bed, completely relaxed, completely integrated. Elena used Moonlight's photos in her presentations to potential adopters because they so clearly illustrated what was possible. This was what integration looked like. It was slow, but it was real. It was transformation happening through the simple act of a family committing to a cat's daily care and providing consistent, patient presence. But integration also required navigating challenges that arose in the early days. Cats that had never used litter boxes before sometimes took weeks to understand the concept. Cats that had lived on the street would sometimes panic indoors, triggering terror responses when they encountered ceiling fans or vacuum cleaners. Cats that had been in hoarding situations sometimes exhibited obsessive behaviors or struggled with the concept of space and boundaries. Elena had learned to help adoptive families navigate these challenges. She would counsel them, "Your cat is not acting out or being difficult. Your cat is processing trauma or learning something entirely new. Your job is to be patient, to understand what the behavior means, and to guide gently toward healthier patterns." When a family reported that their adopted cat was refusing to use the litter box and was eliminating in corners instead, Elena understood that this was often not a behavioral problem, but a communication from the cat about something the cat needed. The cat might need a litter box in a different location. The cat might need a larger box. The cat might need a box with lower sides to facilitate easier access. The cat might be stressed, and the inappropriate elimination was a symptom of stress rather than a problem itself. By helping families understand what behaviors meant and how to respond to them, Elena was helping cats integrate not just into homes, but into true belonging. The cat that had previously been considered difficult or untrainable would, with appropriate guidance, begin to understand the patterns of its new home. The cat would learn what was expected. The cat would learn that its needs could be communicated effectively to the humans caring for it. By 3 months into Mira's adoption, now more than 2 years ago, the integration had been complete. The cat that arrived wet and frightened had become a full member of Elena's household. Mira knew the rhythms of Elena's life. She knew the morning routine, when Elena would feed her and then leave for work. She knew the afternoon hours when Elena was often gone. She knew the evening ritual of interaction and play. She knew when sleep time was coming, knew where the comfortable places to rest were, knew how to navigate every room of the house. But what was remarkable about Mira's integration was that she had learned to communicate her needs to Elena in sophisticated ways. Mira had learned that a specific meow meant she wanted food. A different meow meant she wanted play. A particular movement meant she wanted physical affection. She had learned to use Elena's own language, the language of clear, consistent communication, to express her desires and needs.
This level of integration happened when animals were given time and when humans were attentive enough to recognize patterns. Elena had learned to read Mira's body language, to understand what each posture and vocalization meant, to anticipate the cat's needs. Similarly, Mira had learned to read Elena's emotional state, to understand when Elena was available for engagement and when Elena needed space.
This mutual integration, the human learning to read the animal and the animal learning to read the human, was the foundation of true belonging. It was what separated an adoption that was merely successful from an adoption that was genuinely transformative. In successful adoptions, the cat had food and shelter. In transformative adoptions, the cat had a human who understood it, who anticipated its needs, who celebrated its personality, who loved it as an individual being. As Elena's work with the rescue organization expanded, she found herself increasingly focused on helping adoptive families understand that this deep integration was possible, that it was worth investing in. She developed training programs for volunteers who would do follow-up visits with adoptive families. She created resources about understanding cat behavior, about reading body language, about the specific things that helped traumatized cats feel safe. She also began to share Mira with more people as an example of successful integration. Families would visit Elena's home for training, and Elena would introduce them to Mira. They would see a cat that was completely confident, completely at home, and they would ask Elena how she had achieved this. Elena's answer was always the same: time, patience, consistency, and genuine interest in understanding the cat as an individual. Most important, Elena would tell them, is that you understand this is not just about having a cat. It's about building a life together. The cat is not a possession. The cat is a being with its own personality, its own needs, its own capacity to give and receive affection. Your job is to create an environment where that personality can flourish. Families would nod, understanding intellectually, but some would not fully grasp it until they were in the situation themselves, until they were living day by day with a cat that was gradually opening up, gradually trusting, gradually becoming integrated into their life. Then they would understand viscerally what Elena was describing. They would feel in their own experience the profound joy of watching a traumatized creature become safe, of witnessing trust develop, of being part of that transformation. After 2 years of consistent follow-up work with adoptive families, Elena had data that demonstrated something significant. Families who received detailed adoption guides and regular follow-up support had a 95% success rate with their adopted cats. Families who received minimal support had only a 70% success rate, with many returning the cats to the shelter because integration had been difficult or had failed. This data reinforced Elena's understanding of what rescue really meant. It wasn't just about taking a cat off the street or out of a shelter. It was about supporting that cat's successful integration into a permanent home. It was about staying invested in the outcome, maintaining contact, providing guidance when challenges arose. It was about recognizing that rescue was a process, not a single act, and that the success of rescue depended on ongoing care and attention. Elena brought this data to the rescue organization's board and proposed expanding the adoption support program. She argued that the investment in follow-up support would result in higher success rates, fewer returns, and ultimately more lives saved because foster homes wouldn't be clogged with cats that had been returned due to failed integration. The board agreed, and Elena was given resources to develop a robust adoption support network. Over the next year, Elena trained 15 volunteers to do follow-up visits with adoptive families. She created a database to track all adopted cats and their progress. She developed resources for families facing specific challenges. The result was what Elena had hoped for. Adoption success rates increased, returns decreased, and the rescue organization could save more cats because space in foster homes was freed up by successful permanent placements. Through all of this work, The training, the support, the data collection, the advocacy, Mira remained the living center of Elena's efforts. She was the proof of concept, the example that everything Elena was trying to achieve was possible. Mira had integrated completely. Mira had gone from traumatized stray to beloved family member. And in that integration, she had demonstrated that every cat could make that journey, given the right conditions, given the right human, given time and patience and love. By the 2-year mark of Mira's adoption, the cat had become something unexpected. She had become a community ambassador. Elena brought Mira to adoption events, to training sessions, to community education presentations. People would meet Mira and would be moved by her story. They would see a healthy, happy cat and would hear about where she had come from, and they would be inspired to adopt, to foster, to help in some way. Sophia, the 7-year-old girl from the Ramirez family, had become Mira's particular fan. Every time the Ramirez family visited Elena's home to drop off or pick up a foster cat, Sophia would ask if she could see Mira. Sophia would sit with Mira, would tell the cat about the foster cats, would share stories about Poppy's antics. Mira, patient and affectionate with the child, seemed to understand that Sophia was a young human who loved her, who celebrated her, who saw her as something special. This, too, was part of integration. Not just integration into Elena's individual life, but integration into a broader community of people who were committed to rescue work. Mira had become a symbol, a representative, a teacher. She was still just a cat, still spending most of her days in Elena's home playing with toys and napping in favorite spots. But she was also more than that. She was evidence of what was possible. She was hope made manifest in fur and purring. And as she sat on couches in Elena's living room, as she watched foster cats gradually learn to trust, as she engaged with visitors and volunteers and children and all the humans who came through Elena's life because of rescue work, Mira was integrating into something larger than a single household. She was integrating into a movement, into a community, into the ongoing work of transforming lives, both human and feline, through the power of rescue, care, and commitment. There is a moment in the life of a rescued animal when survival transforms into living. It is not a specific day or hour, but rather a gradual recognition that the animal has moved beyond the question, "Will I survive?" into the realm of, "How can I flourish?" For Mira, this transformation was now complete. She had crossed the threshold nearly 3 years after her rescue, and in crossing it had become something she had never been before, not a survivor, but a beloved being fully integrated into a life that was built around her well-being, her happiness, her flourishing. The evidence of this transformation was visible in the simplest things. The way Mira moved through Elena's home had changed fundamentally. She no longer moved with the efficiency of a creature calculating routes for escape. She moved with the expansiveness of someone who belonged completely. She would stretch luxuriously on the couch. She would run through the house for the simple joy of running. She would take unnecessary routes to get from one room to another, pausing to investigate something interesting, or simply moving through space without purpose except the movement itself. Her body bore all the marks of thriving. The scars that had been visible in early photos had faded. Her coat, once matted and dull, was now glossy and sleek. She had reached a healthy weight, not the excessive weight of a cat that overate, but the solid musculature and clean lines of a cat that was well-fed and active. Her eyes, which had once held a particular wariness, now held a kind of contentment, a clarity that suggested an animal whose emotional needs were being met. But the most significant evidence of blossoming was in her personality. As the trauma and fear receded, Mira's individual nature became increasingly visible. She was, Elena had discovered, a cat of distinct preferences and quirks. She loved to play, but only during specific times of day. She preferred certain toys. The feather wand was her favorite, but she had no interest in the toy mice. She was affectionate, but on her own terms.
She would initiate contact, but would also withdraw when she needed space. She was intelligent and problem-solving, spending hours investigating puzzle feeders and eventually mastering the mechanical challenges they presented. Mira had also developed what Elena recognized as genuine personality tics, little habits that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with being an individual being. She would greet Elena in the morning by meowing a specific greeting. She had a particular stretching routine she performed after sleeping. She would make biscuits, kneading her paws alternately when she was especially content. She had a habit of knocking small objects off shelves and watching them fall, as though the act itself was amusing to her. These quirks were not signs of trauma or damage. They were evidence of a personality expressing itself. They were the particular marks of Mira as an individual, the things that made her different from every other cat, that made her uniquely herself. And for Elena, these quirks were precious. They represented the fullness of who Mira was, beyond her history, beyond her trauma, simply as a being. The relationship between Elena and Mira had also matured into something deeper than the initial rescue and recovery dynamic. They had become genuine companions. Elena could read Mira's moods through subtle shifts in her behavior. Mira could read Elena's emotional state and would, at times when Elena was stressed or sad, make extra effort to seek her out and provide comfort. They had developed a shorthand of communication, looks and sounds that carried meaning built up through years of living together. There was a particular morning, about 3 years after Mira's rescue, that encapsulated the fullness of this relationship. Elena woke before her alarm, as she sometimes did. Mira was already awake, curled up against Elena's side, purring softly. Elena reached over and gently stroked the cat's head. Mira opened her eyes and looked directly at Elena, and in that moment of mutual recognition, Elena felt the profundity of what they had built together. "Good morning," Elena said softly. "Are you ready for breakfast?" Mira responded with a chirp, not quite a meow, something between a meow and a vocalization that Elena understood to mean yes. Elena got out of bed, and Mira followed her, as she did every morning, into the kitchen. Elena prepared Mira's breakfast, placing the bowl on the floor. Mira ate with obvious enjoyment, and Elena made her own breakfast, the two of them existing in comfortable companionship in the morning quiet. This was blossoming. Not the dramatic transformation of recovery, but the subtle, continuous expression of a being that was fully home, fully safe, fully loved. The moments were ordinary, almost mundane, but they were built on a foundation of extraordinary commitment and transformation. Around this time, Elena noticed something significant in the broader rescue work she was doing. The families that had adopted cats years earlier were starting to circle back. They wanted to share updates on how their cats were doing. They wanted to express gratitude for Elena's support. Some of them wanted to become more involved in rescue work themselves. The Ramirez family, for example, reported that Poppy had been integrated for nearly 2 years and was now an essential part of their family. Sophia was now 9 years old and had been volunteering with Elena at adoption events, talking to children about the importance of rescue and adoption. David and Maria had decided to foster more cats. They were now planning to set up a separate foster space in their home to care for multiple cats at once. Kevin, who had adopted Cassandra, reported that the cat had continued to open up and now would actually sit on his lap and purr. Kevin had become so invested in rescue work that he had started a support group for families who had adopted feral or semi-feral cats, creating a community where people could share strategies for patients and for managing the particular challenges of these adoptions. The Chens, who had adopted Moonlight, sent Elena a photo taken just before the 3-year anniversary of Moonlight's adoption. Moonlight was in the photo with all 5 members of the Chen family, completely relaxed, integrated into their lives in a way that suggested she had always been there. The email read, We wanted to thank you for helping us adopt Moonlight. She's changed our family in ways we couldn't have anticipated. Our children have learned patience, compassion, and the reality of rescue. Our home feels complete with her in it. Every time I think about where she came from, I'm humbled that we were able to help."
Reading emails like this, Elena recognized what was happening. The rescue work was rippling outward. One adoption wasn't just one cat finding a home. One adoption was often the beginning of a family's involvement in rescue, the catalyst for their own transformation, from passive observers to active participants. The impact multiplied exponentially.
Elena brought this observation to the rescue organization's leadership and proposed a new initiative, a rescue alumni network. Families who had adopted cats through the rescue organization would be invited to participate in a community of people committed to ongoing support of rescue work. They would receive updates about how many other cats had been saved, stories of transformations, opportunities to contribute to the organization's mission through volunteering, donations, or advocacy. The response was overwhelming. Within months, the Rescue Alumni Network had over 200 members. These families were contributing financially, volunteering their time, advocating in their communities for adoption and spay and neuter programs. They were becoming a force multiplier for the organization's mission. And at the center of this effort was Mira's story, the example of what rescue could accomplish, the evidence that transformation was possible, the proof that one life, fully lived and fully loved, could inspire many other lives to be saved. By the 3-year anniversary of Mira's rescue, the numbers were striking. Elena and her team had placed 156 cats in permanent homes. Of those adoptions, 147 remained stable. The cats were still in their adoptive homes, were thriving, were beloved. The other 9 had been returned, and in each case, Elena had worked with the family to understand the challenges and had either helped them work through the issues or had facilitated readoption to a better Ash family. In every single case, the cat had ultimately found a stable, permanent home. But beyond the numbers was something more meaningful, the quality of lives that had been saved. These weren't just statistics. They were individual beings, each one with a particular story, each one with unique needs, each one with the capacity to give and receive love. They were Poppy, living with the Ramirez family and teaching their children about compassion. They were Cassandra, learning to trust through Kevin's patient care. They were Moonlight, integrating into the Chen family's daily life. They were 156 different cats, each one a world unto itself, each one with the potential to flourish that they were now actualizing. And they were all, in some way, descendants of Mira's story. Each of them was rescued, at least in part, because Elena had learned from Mira what rescue meant. Each of them was thriving because Elena had developed her skills and understanding through the long process of helping Mira heal and integrate. Each of them was proof that the investment in one life created the capacity to invest in many lives. This was the fullness of Mira's blossoming, not just her own transformation from traumatized street cat to beloved companion, but her role in transforming other cats' lives, in inspiring humans to take up the work of rescue, in becoming the foundation upon which a rescue movement was being built. Mira herself seemed to understand that she was part of something larger. When Elena brought new foster cats into the home, Mira would engage with them in ways that suggested she was helping them understand that trust was possible. When families visited Elena's home to learn about adoption, Mira would greet them with the calm confidence of a cat that had nothing to fear, and her presence seemed to communicate something to the visiting humans, some sense that if this cat could transform, then perhaps all the other frightened cats in the world could transform too. One evening, 3 years and 1 month after her rescue, Elena was sitting on the couch with Mira when she received a message from an unexpected source. It was from the veterinary clinic where Mira had first been taken after rescue. Dr. Chen had received a forwarded story from a cat rescue organization in another city.
The story was about a woman who had adopted a rescued cat and had been so inspired by the transformation that she had started her own foster program based on the principles that Elena had developed. That woman had read about Elena's work through social media, had been inspired by the photographs and stories, and had decided to do the same work in her own city. Dr. Chen's message was simple. Look what Mira started. Elena showed Mira the message, though the cat couldn't read it. But Elena understood. Mira's story, which had begun with cold and hunger and fear on the streets, had now traveled across state lines and inspired others to take up the work of rescue. How many cats had been saved because Mira had been rescued? How many lives had been transformed? The number was impossible to calculate, but it was real. It was measurable in the lives of individual animals and families. This understanding of Mira's impact didn't change anything about their daily life. Mira was still simply Mira, a cat that ate breakfast every morning, that played with toys during particular times of day, that slept on Elena's bed at night, that purred when content and withdrew when overwhelmed. But she was also something more, a symbol, an inspiration, a catalyst for change. The blossoming that Mira had undergone was complete. She had transformed from a traumatized survivor to a beloved family member. But in that transformation, she had also become something else, a force for good in the world, an ambassador for rescue, a teacher to many humans about what love and commitment could accomplish. She had gone from struggling to survive on the streets to thriving in Elena's home. But she had also gone from being unknown to being known, from being invisible to being seen as valuable, from being one of thousands of suffering animals to being the center of a growing movement for change. And through it all, she was still simply Mira, a cat with her own preferences, her own personality, her own value as an individual being. The blossoming had revealed who she had always been, not just a survivor, but a beloved being worthy of love, capable of giving love, deserving of the future she had been given. There is a particular kind of mathematics that operates in the world of rescue. Not the arithmetic of simple addition, but the exponential multiplication of impact. One life saved becomes the foundation for saving many more lives. One human transformed by the act of rescue becomes an agent for transforming other humans. One story of redemption ripples outward, touching shores the original actor never anticipated reaching. This is the mathematics of hope, and it is the legacy that Mira, through the simple act of being rescued and loved, had set in motion. By the 4th anniversary of Mira's rescue, the ripples had expanded in ways that were difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Elena had documented the primary impacts: 156 cats placed, 147 stable adoptions, a foster network of 15 trained volunteers. But the secondary impacts, the families inspired to adopt, the organizations influenced by Elena's methods, the children educated about rescue, the change in community attitudes toward adoption, these were harder to measure, but in many ways more significant. The Ramirez family had become the heart of a grassroots community effort. Maria and David had expanded their fostering program until they were caring for 3 foster cats at a time. They had created a social media presence documenting their foster cats' journeys from rescue to adoption. Their posts had garnered thousands of followers, people from across the country who were learning about rescue through the images and stories the Ramirez family shared. Sophia, now 10 years old, had developed a following of her own, young people her age who were inspired by her passion for rescue and animal welfare. More significantly, the Ramirez family had influenced their extended family. Maria's sisters had each adopted rescue cats. David's brother and his family had become active volunteers with the rescue organization. The impact had spread through kinship networks, creating pockets of rescue advocates throughout their community. Kevin, who had adopted Cassandra, had developed his support group for families with feral and semi-feral cats into a formal organization with a website, monthly online meetings, and a library of resources. The group had grown to over 300 members. Families dealing with the challenges of integrating very traumatized cats could now find guidance, community, and hope through Kevin's organization. Cassandra, the cat that many initial evaluators had deemed unadoptable, had become the inspiration for a network helping dozens of other cats and families navigate similar challenges. The Chens had taken a different approach, but with equally significant impact. They had created a scholarship fund to support veterinary education, specifically scholarships for students interested in shelter medicine and rescue animal care. Dr. Chen, who had treated Mira in those early days, had connected with the Chens and had begun mentoring veterinary students through their scholarship program. These students, educated with a focus on rescue animals, would go on to treat thousands of animals in their careers, working in shelters and rescue organizations throughout the country. The ripples extended even further. A documentary filmmaker had learned about Elena's work and had started production on a film about rescue, adoption, and the human-animal bond. The film would feature Elena's story and Mira's transformation, but would also include stories from dozens of other rescue families. When the documentary premiered at a film festival, it won an award and began traveling to other festivals, eventually being picked up by a streaming service. Hundreds of thousands of people would watch the film and would, at minimum, reconsider their attitudes toward adoption. A journalist had heard about Elena's Rescue Alumni Network initiative and had written a long-form article about the program for a national magazine. The article, illustrated with photographs of Mira and other rescue cats, explored how rescue organizations could create sustained engagement with adoptive families. The article prompted other rescue organizations across the country to adopt similar models. The impact of Elena's innovation was being scaled nationally, affecting how hundreds of organizations approached adoptions and follow-up support. An animal behaviorist had reviewed Elena's work and had reached out about collaborating on a research project studying long-term outcomes of rescue adoptions. The resulting study, published in a peer-reviewed journal, provided data-driven evidence for what Elena had intuitively understood. Rescue cats placed with families who received adequate support and guidance had significantly better long-term outcomes than cats placed without such support. This research would influence animal welfare policy and best practices in rescue organizations. But perhaps most significantly, Mira herself had become the subject of a children's book. A children's author had learned about Mira's story and had written a picture book for young children titled Mira's Journey, From the Streets to Home. The book, illustrated with warm and beautiful artwork, told Mira's story in age-appropriate language. It was published by a major children's publisher and was distributed to libraries and schools across the country. Children who might never meet Mira or know about rescue work would read about her story and would learn from a young age that rescue mattered, that animals deserved compassion, that one person could make a difference. Each of these developments, the Ramirez family's expanding advocacy, Kevin's support network, the Chen family scholarship fund, the documentary, the magazine article, the research publication, the children's book, was connected to Mira. Each one emerged from the original rescue and had rippled outward from there. But Mira herself, in her daily life, remained unaware of the impact she was having. She was simply a cat living her life in Elena's home, blissfully unaware that her story was inspiring rescue efforts, changing policies, educating children, transforming communities. This gap between Mira's experience and her impact was something Elena often reflected on. Mira had no idea that she had become a symbol, an ambassador, a force for change. She simply knew that she was loved, that she was safe, that her daily needs were met. And in that simplicity lay a kind of profound truth. The most important impact was not in what Mira knew or did consciously, but in what her existence, her transformation from trauma to thriving, meant to others. The rescue organization itself had undergone significant changes influenced by Elena's work. The organization had expanded from operating a single shelter facility to operating multiple foster networks. They had hired professional staff dedicated to adoption support and family education. They had implemented Elena's innovations as standard practice throughout the organization. The result was that adoption success rates had improved organization-wide. Fewer cats were being returned. More lives were being saved. The organization's leadership had also made Elena the director of the adoption and family support programs. In this role, Elena oversaw the training of 25 volunteers, managed partnerships with veterinary clinics and behaviorists, and developed policy for the organization. Her influence had expanded from her individual foster work to shaping the direction of the entire organization. But with this expanded role came a new realization. As Elena worked with more people, more families, more animals, she began to understand the vastness of the problem she was working to solve. For every cat that was rescued and placed successfully, dozens remained on the streets. For every family inspired to adopt, hundreds still purchased from breeders or pet stores. For every rescue organization innovating and improving, many others still operated with outdated, ineffective practices. The work that Elena and all the volunteers and families and organizations were doing mattered enormously, but it was also just the beginning of what needed to be done. This realization prompted Elena to think more deeply about systemic change. The individual rescues, the family adoptions, the support networks, all of it was important and valuable. But real change would require shifting cultural attitudes about animals, about rescue, about the value of adoption. It would require changes to legislation and policy. It would require education and advocacy on a larger scale. Elena found herself becoming increasingly involved in animal welfare advocacy. She began attending city council meetings to advocate for policies supporting spay and neuter programs. She partnered with other rescue organizations to develop educational campaigns about adoption. She gave presentations at schools and community centers about rescue and animal welfare. She worked with legislators to develop better policies around animal cruelty and abandonment. Through all of this expanded work, Mira remained Elena's anchor. When Elena felt overwhelmed by the scope of the work that remained to be done, she would come home to Mira. She would sit with the cat, would experience again the profound comfort of Mira's purr, would be reminded of why she did this work. Mira was the evidence. Mira was the proof that individual lives could be transformed, that hope was justified, that the work was worth doing. 4 years into Mira's rescue, Elena sat down with Marcus, her longtime friend and supporter, and reflected on the journey. "Do you ever think about the alternative?" Marcus asked. "What would have happened if you hadn't found Mira that night in the rain?" Elena considered the question seriously. "Mira would probably have died that winter," she said. "Stray cats have rough lives. The mortality rate is high. But beyond that, the rescue organization might never have grown the way it has. I might never have become involved in advocacy work. The Ramirez family might never have started fostering. The documentary might never have been made. All the cats that were saved as a result of these ripples, they might never have been saved." "So, one night in the rain changed everything," Marcus said. "One night in the rain changed everything," Elena agreed. "Not just for Mira, but for potentially hundreds of cats, for families who were transformed by adoption, for a community that learned to value rescue." The conversation stayed with Elena. She began to think about how frequently these pivotal moments happened, moments where a human encountered an animal in need and made a choice to help. Every rescue organization, every successful foster home, every adoption that worked, each one likely had a moment like this at its foundation. Someone saw need. Someone decided to respond. From that seed, everything else grew. Elena decided to document these moments. She began collecting stories from rescue families, foster homes, volunteers, and adopters.
She asked them to recall the moment they first encountered the animal they had rescued or adopted. What had they seen? What had they felt? What had prompted them to take action? The stories that came back were remarkably consistent. There was always a moment of seeing, truly seeing an animal's need. There was always an emotional response. There was always a choice point, help or look away. And those who chose to help reported that the choice had fundamentally changed their lives. Elena compiled these stories into a document that she titled The Moment: Stories of Rescue and Transformation. She shared it with the rescue organization, and they began using it in their community education efforts. The stories were so compelling, so real, so emotionally resonant that people who read them often reported being moved to tears and then moved to action. They would come to adoption events, they would apply to foster, they would volunteer, they would donate. The stories of others' choices to help prompted their own choices to help. This document, like the documentary and the magazine article and the children's book, was another ripple from Mira's rescue. Because Mira's story was included, was featured as the foundational example of what rescue could mean. Her transformation from cold, wet, frightened street cat to beloved family member was the emotional center around which many of the other stories circled. By the 4th anniversary of Mira's rescue, the legacy was clear. One act of compassion, in one moment on one rainy evening, had catalyzed a chain of events that would ultimately touch thousands of lives. Not all rescue stories would have such expansive ripples, but any rescue could have them. Any person who chose to help a suffering animal was potentially setting in motion a cascade of changes that could extend far beyond their own community, far beyond their own lifetime. This understanding didn't change Elena's commitment to individual rescue. She still fostered cats. She still provided support to adoptive families. She still spent time with Mira every single day, appreciating the companionship of this one cat she had loved into thriving. But it did expand her sense of what rescue meant. It meant not just saving individual lives, but potentially transforming communities, changing attitudes, shifting culture. And Mira, unaware of the magnitude of her impact, continued to live her life, playing with toys, napping in warm places, purring when Elena came home from work, providing comfort to new foster cats, being a symbol of hope to everyone who encountered her story. In her simple existence, in her transformation from trauma to thriving, she was teaching everyone who knew her story a fundamental truth: that one life, fully loved and fully lived, could matter enormously. That rescue was not a small thing. That hope was justified. That change was possible. Time moves differently for animals than for humans. A cat does not measure her existence in years or in accomplishments. She does not reflect on her past or worry about her future. She exists in a continuous present, in the eternal now of each moment. But humans, who are cursed and blessed with the ability to remember and anticipate, experience time as a narrative, a story with a beginning, middle, and ongoing unfolding. For Mira, the passage of years had left its marks, subtle and gentle. The gray in her coat had deepened slightly. Her movements, while still fluid and graceful, carried occasionally a slight stiffness that spoke of the early arthritis that Dr. Chen had detected years earlier. The sprints across the house were less frequent, replaced by longer periods of rest in favored sunny spots. The intensity of play had mellowed into something gentler, more contemplative, though no less joyful. She was, at 4 years post-rescue, approaching what might be considered middle age for a cat. Dr. Chen had estimated at her most recent checkup that Mira was probably around 5 or 6 years old, meaning she had likely spent her first year or so on the streets before her rescue. But even accounting for the years of hardship, her life with Elena had given her back those lost years. She was thriving in ways that street cats rarely did. She would likely live well into her teens, possibly into her 20s, given the quality of care she received. The house where Mira lived had become more than a shelter.
It had become the complete universe of her existence. Every corner held meaning. The kitchen was the place where food appeared. The bedroom was the place for deepest rest. The living room couch was the center of family life. The windowsills were observation posts where the outside world could be safely viewed. The closet in the bedroom was the retreat place when the world was overwhelming. Each space served a purpose in the architecture of Mira's daily life, and she knew each space intimately, had mapped it thoroughly, understood it completely. Elena, now in her early 40s, often reflected that she had become a different person through the process of adopting and caring for Mira. The woman who had sat on a wet sidewalk offering tuna to a frightened cat had done so out of impulse, out of compassion in the moment. But that impulse had led to a complete restructuring of how Elena understood herself, her values, her purpose. Elena's career as a social worker had been meaningful work, but her work with rescue had become something more. It had become a calling, a mission, the central organizing principle of her life. But more than her external life, Elena's internal life had been transformed. She had learned patience through Mira's slow healing. She had learned commitment through the daily act of caring for another being. She had learned humility through understanding how much love an animal could give when given the chance. She had learned hope through witnessing transformation. And she had learned that one person could make a difference, not just in one individual's life, but in many lives, through a chain of choices and commitments. The relationship between Elena and Mira had deepened into something that transcended the conventional labels of human and pet. They were companions, yes. They were also mirrors for each other, reflecting back the other's capacity for growth and transformation. They were, in many ways, responsible for each other's thriving. Mira dependent on Elena's physical care and emotional investment, Elena dependent on Mira's affection and unconditional presence. On a particular autumn morning, 4 years and 3 months after Mira's rescue, Elena woke, as she often did, to find Mira already awake, watching her with those eyes that had seen so much, fear and cold and hunger once, but now only warmth and safety and love. Elena reached over and began to stroke Mira's head, a gesture they had performed thousands of times. Mira responded by moving closer, settling against Elena's body, purring. "Good morning," Elena whispered. "Are you ready for breakfast?" Mira responded with a small chirp, her particular greeting, the sound that Elena had learned meant affection and acknowledgement. Elena got out of bed, and Mira followed as she always did, trailing behind her through the house, present in every moment of Elena's morning routine. In the kitchen, Elena prepared Mira's breakfast with the same care she would have given to preparing her own meal. She selected the wet food that Mira preferred on this particular morning, a mix of fish and vegetables, something the cat had always loved. She placed it in the ceramic bowl that Mira had eaten from for years. She set it in the familiar spot on the kitchen floor. And then she prepared her own breakfast while Mira ate, the two of them existing in comfortable silence, the companionship of shared presence. After breakfast, they moved to their favorite sitting spot, the living room couch where morning light streamed through the windows. Mira jumped up onto the cushion and settled into a patch of sunshine. Elena sat beside her, her arm around the cat's body, and together they sat in silence. This was a regular ritual, one of dozens of small rituals that structured their days. The ritual had no purpose beyond itself. It was not about accomplishing anything or going anywhere. It was about being present, about the simple fact of love made manifest in shared time. Elena's work continued to expand. She had been invited to speak at a national animal welfare conference. She was consulting with multiple rescue organizations on implementing her adoption support models. She was beginning work on a book about rescue and adoption that would document both the practical elements and the emotional dimensions of what she had learned through her work with Mira and hundreds of other animals. But increasingly, Elena was also becoming aware of something important, that the most valuable part of her work was not the public speaking or the consulting or even the direct rescue work. It was the simple act of sitting with Mira in a patch of morning sunlight, fully present, fully engaged, fully aware of the profound privilege of being loved by and loving another being. This small moment, repeated daily for years, was the foundation upon which everything else was built. Because in this moment of quiet companionship, Elena was living a truth that her rescue work was based on, that one, being fully knowing and fully loved, was worth extraordinary investment. That the daily acts of care, the feeding, the attention, the consistency, were not burdensome duties but profound privileges. That the reciprocal love between human and animal was one of the most genuine and transformative connections possible.
She would take this understanding, this lived experience, into all her other work. When she spoke to adoptive families, she spoke with the authority of someone who had lived the experience of rescuing and caring for an animal. When she consulted with rescue organizations, she did so with the wisdom that came from daily practice. When she worked with volunteers, she shared not theories, but the lessons she had learned from 4 years of showing up every single day for one cat.
This was what rescue truly meant. Not the dramatic rescue moment, though that mattered. Not the medical recovery, though that was crucial. Not the successful adoption and placement, though that was the goal. Rescue meant the daily commitment to another being's well-being. It meant the choice, made again and again, to prioritize that being's needs and happiness. It meant learning to love in a way that was present and unconditional and complete. On this particular morning, as Elena sat with Mira in the sunlight, she thought about the cat that had arrived wet and frightened, huddled in a blanket. She thought about the months of recovery, the setbacks and triumphs, the gradual opening up to trust. She thought about how that one small act, sitting on a wet sidewalk with a container of tuna, had led here, to this moment, to this life, to this profound connection. She thought about all the other moments that had connected to that first moment. The call to Dr. Chen, the adoption decision, the choice to become a foster home, the decision to work with the rescue organization, the development of new models and programs, the impact on hundreds of families and hundreds of cats. All of it traced back to this one cat, to this one moment of seeing a need and choosing to respond.
But more than that, she thought about the everyday moments that made up a life. The morning greetings, the playtime, the rest periods, the simple act of existing together in shared space. These moments, unglamorous and unrecorded, were the heart of everything. They were why rescue mattered. They were why transformation was possible. They were why hope was justified.
Mira, in the patch of sunlight, began to knead her paws, the biscuit-making behavior that meant contentment. Her eyes had closed. She was purring. She was completely at peace, completely at home, completely absorbed in the present moment. She did not know the story of where she had come from. She did not know the impact her life had had. She did not know anything beyond the immediate reality of warmth and safety and love. And perhaps that was the most important lesson of all, that the deepest transformations were not about grand narratives or historical impact. They were about individual beings learning to be safe, to be loved, to be at home. They were about one cat, in one moment, in one home, experiencing the profound peace of knowing that she belonged. This was what forever home meant. Not just a permanent physical location, but a state of being where a creature understood, at the deepest level, that it was safe, that it was loved, that it had a place in the world that was truly its own. Mira had earned this home through her own resilience and her willingness to trust again despite the harm she had endured. Elena had earned the privilege of being Mira's person through her commitment to showing up day after day with unconditional love and care. The story of Mira's rescue was complete in the sense that it had reached its destination. The cat that had been lost was found. The cat that had suffered was healed. The cat that had been frightened had learned to trust. The narrative arc had resolved. The transformation was complete. But the story was also ongoing, would continue to unfold for as long as Mira lived. Every morning, every meal, every moment of play or rest, every gesture of affection, these were the ongoing chapters of Mira's story, the continuing evidence that rescue was real, that transformation was lasting, that home was not a destination reached once, but a state continuously chosen and recreated through daily acts of love and commitment. As the morning light shifted and deepened, Elena remained on the couch with Mira. She had nowhere to be, nothing more important to do than this. She had learned, through years of showing up for this one cat, that presence was the greatest gift one being could offer another. That time, freely given, was the most profound form of love. That home was not a place, but a quality of relationship. The knowledge that one was known, valued, loved, and completely at peace. Mira stirred slightly, opened her eyes, and looked at Elena. In that look was recognition, was affection, was the embodiment of belonging. Elena reached over and stroked the cat's head one more time. And in that moment, in that simple gesture, in that continuing present, where rescue cat and rescuer sat together in morning sunlight, everything was complete. Everything was enough. Everything was home. The rain that had brought them together on that cold November evening 4 years ago seemed impossibly distant now. A memory from a different life, a threshold moment that had led here. But Mira did not remember the rain. She only knew the sunlight. She only knew the warmth of Elena's presence. She only knew that she was safe, that she was loved, that she was home. And that knowledge, that lived experience of being rescued from despair into thriving, was the ultimate victory. Not over the streets or illness or trauma, though those victories mattered, but victory over the fear that such rescue was impossible, over the despair that suggested some lives were too damaged to be saved, over the resignation that accepted suffering as inevitable. Mira's story, from the streets to home, was the answer to the question that had animated her existence for that first difficult year: will I survive? The answer, given not once but continuously through every day since, was yes. Yes, survival was possible. Yes, transformation was possible. Yes, love was possible. Yes, home was real, and it was waiting, and it was worth the journey to reach it. In the eternal now of Mira's present moment, as she rested in sunlight beside the human who had saved her, this truth was fully realized. One life, seen, valued, loved, transformed. Not unique in its struggles or in its capacity for resilience, but profound in its simplicity, in its ordinariness, in its demonstration that rescue was not extraordinary, but a fundamental possibility available to any human who saw need and chose to respond. Forever Home was not a destination. It was an ongoing present, a continuous choosing, a daily recreation of safety and love. And Mira, who had been nobody's cat and no one's priority, was now deeply, irrevocably, completely home. She was known, she was loved, she mattered. And in that mattering lay everything: the justification for rescue, the proof that transformation was real, the evidence that hope was not naive, but essential. The story of the stray cat that found home was complete. It was complete because it continued, day by day, moment by moment, in the small miracles of daily companionship and unconditional love.